The sun rose over Los Angeles on the morning of August 9, 1969, pale and indifferent, spilling thin light across the canyons and the sprawling, restless city below. The heat was already beginning to build, a dry, suffocating blanket that promised another day of shimmering asphalt and languid palm trees. Up in the hills, in the exclusive enclave of Benedict Canyon, the winding roads were quiet, lined with expensive homes hidden behind hedges and security gates. It was a place of retreat for the wealthy, the famous, the beautiful, a world away from the turmoil of the late 60s, the war protests, the civil rights marches. The counterculture ferment that was tearing the nation apart at the seams. At 10,050 Silo Drive, a secluded estate perched at the end of a long, steep driveway, the stillness was absolute. The house, a sprawling ranch-style structure, sat serene against the rugged hillside, its windows dark, its garden fragrant with the scent of eucalyptus and pine. Inside, the bodies lay where they had fallen hours before, soaked in shadow and silence, the blood already beginning to darken and dry on the expensive furnishings and the deep pile carpets. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came just after 8 o'clock that morning. Winifred Chapman, the young housekeeper, arrived for work as she always did. Stepping out of her car and walking toward the front door with the quiet routine of someone who had done this 100 times before. She had worked for the occupants of the house, the famous film director Roman Polanski and his wife, the actress Sharon Tate, for some time now, and she was accustomed to the casual, luxurious rhythm of their household. But this morning, as she approached the house, she noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. The front door was not fully closed. A screen door hung slightly ajar, and just beyond it, on the porch, she could see what looked like a bundle of white rope, twisted and abandoned. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Something didn't feel right. She pushed the door open gently, calling out, but no answer came. The house was unnervingly still, and then she saw them. On the floor of the living room, just a few steps inside, 2 bodies lay huddled together, covered in blood. The scene was so incomprehensible, so nightmarish, that for a moment her mind simply refused to register it. She screamed a raw, piercing sound that shattered the morning calm, and stumbled backward out the door and down the driveway, her legs barely carrying her. She reached the neighbor's house, a couple named Asin, and sobbing, gasped out that there had been a terrible accident at the Polanski residence. They telephoned the police. The first patrol car arrived within minutes. Officers Jerry DeRosa and Thomas Weissenhunt were seasoned policemen, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the slaughterhouse they were about to enter. They walked through the gate, past the white rope, and into the living room. There on the floor lay a young woman in a white dress, Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant with her first child, and a man later identified as her friend, the hairstylist Jay Sebring. Both had been stabbed repeatedly. A white nylon rope was looped around Tate's neck, the other end draped over a rafter, then connected to Sebring's wrist. The room was a tableau of horror, the walls smeared with blood. On the front door, written in what appeared to be blood, was a single word, pig. Outside on the lawn, the body of an 18-year-old named Stephen Parent lay slumped in his car, a rambler, shot 4 times in the chest and head. He had been visiting the caretaker of the estate, William Garrettson, who lived in a guest house behind the main residence. Miraculously, Garrettson had survived the night, apparently unaware of the carnage that had unfolded a short distance away. And near the front door, sprawled on the ground beside the driveway, was the body of Wojtek Frykowski, a Polish screenwriter and friend of Polanski, who had been stabbed and bludgeoned so savagely that his face was barely recognizable. His girlfriend, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, was discovered on the front lawn, her white nightgown stained crimson, multiple stab wounds puncturing her body. The police officers moved through the scene in a daze, their minds struggling to comprehend the sheer brutality on display. This was not a simple murder, it was an orgy of violence, a scene of almost ritualistic slaughter. The word pig, scrawled in the blood of the victims, seemed to taunt them from the door. What kind of human being could commit such an act? What message was this supposed to send? The investigation that began that morning would consume the city of Los Angeles for months, sending shockwaves through the film industry, the music scene, and the entire nation. The names Sharon Tate and Charles Manson would become forever linked in the darkest chapter of American crime history. But to understand how such a thing could happen, To understand the forces that converged on that quiet house in the hills, we must go back years before, to the small, dusty towns of the American Midwest and the deepening shadows of a broken childhood. Because Charles Manson was not born a monster, he was made, twisted, and shaped by a world that seemed to have no place for him from the very beginning. Charles Mills Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 16-year-old mother named Kathleen Maddox. His entrance into the world was steeped in chaos and instability from the very first breath. Kathleen was a troubled girl, a product of poverty and neglect herself, and she drifted through life with a recklessness that would leave an indelible mark on her son. She was married briefly to a man named William Manson, who gave Charles his surname, but the marriage was over almost before it began, and the boy never knew his real father. Kathleen was an alcoholic and, by some accounts, a petty criminal, in and out of jail for various minor offenses. Charles was often left in the care of relatives, an aunt, a grandmother who was a stern religious woman, but the sense of abandonment and rootlessness was already sinking deep into his bones. One of the few stories that Manson himself would later tell about his mother, with a strange mixture of bitterness and dark humor, was that she once traded him for a pitcher of beer. The transaction took place in a diner when he was a small child. A childless waitress took a liking to him, and Kathleen, having no money and a powerful thirst, jokingly offered to swap the boy for the drink. The waitress took the offer seriously, and for a few days, Charles actually lived with the woman until his mother, pressured by family, came back to reclaim him. Whether the story was entirely true or a tall tale Manson embellished, it captured the essential truth of his early life. He was an unwanted child, a burden to be passed around. A piece of human currency with no real value. When Kathleen was incarcerated for armed robbery, young Charles was sent to live with an aunt and uncle in McMechen, West Virginia. The town was a gritty, industrial place, and the household was strict, punctuated by religious fervor and harsh discipline. Charles was a small, wiry boy, with bright, intense eyes that could shift from innocent to cunning in a heartbeat. He was not stupid, on the contrary, he was sharp, observant, and possessed a feral intelligence that allowed him to read people with uncanny accuracy. But he chafed against authority, and the rigid structure of his aunt's home only fueled his rebellious streak. He began committing petty crimes, stealing candy, breaking into stores, small acts of defiance that promised a taste of freedom and a way to strike back at a world that had never wanted him. At the age of 9, he was sent to a reform school for the first time, the first of many institutional incarcerations that would define his adolescence and young adulthood. The Gibault School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, was a cold, unforgiving place where the boys were beaten for infractions and the strong preyed on the weak. It was here that Charles learned the brutal lessons of survival, how to manipulate, how to intimidate, how to lie with a straight face, and how to endure pain. He was raped repeatedly by older boys, a trauma he buried deep inside, later weaponizing it into a philosophy of power and domination. He ran away from Gibault multiple times, and each time he was returned, the system hammered him a little harder, smoothing the rough edges of his humanity into something sharper, more dangerous. By the time he was a teenager, Charles Manson had accumulated a rap sheet that included burglary, car theft, and armed robbery. He became a drifter, traveling across the country, committing crimes to survive, and landing in one reformatory after another. At a federal reformatory in Chillicothe, Ohio, he was introduced to the world of hardened criminals and learned the pimp's trade. The art of psychological manipulation that would later prove so devastatingly effective. He studied how to break a person's will, how to isolate them from friends and family, how to offer a perverse kind of love that was really just control. These were the classrooms where his dark genius was forged. The 1950s and early 1960s passed in a blur of prisons: the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia, the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, the Terminal Island Federal Penitentiary in Los Angeles. Manson spent more than half of his first 32 years behind bars, and the experience transformed him into a uniquely dangerous individual. He had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the criminal mind, but he also possessed a strange magnetism, a way of speaking that could draw people in and make them feel, for a fleeting moment, that they were the only person in the world who mattered to him. He studied Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People while in prison, treating it as a textbook for the psychology of persuasion. He learned to play the guitar and dreamed of becoming a famous musician, a fantasy that would later drive him toward the edges of the Hollywood elite. On March 21, 1967, Charles Manson walked out of the gates of Terminal Island a free man. He was 32 years old, and he had spent the entirety of his adult life within the confines of institutions. He stepped blinking into the California sunshine, a small, wiry figure with a shaved head and prison-pale skin, and surveyed the world that had changed so much during his incarceration. The summer of love was about to bloom in San Francisco, and the streets were thronged with young people, runaways, seekers, dreamers, dropouts, all searching for something new. A break from the stifling conformity of their parents' generation. They wore flowers in their hair, they took psychedelic drugs, they preached peace and free love, and they were achingly, desperately vulnerable. To a predator like Charles Manson, they were a flock of sheep awaiting a shepherd. He made his way to the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, where the counterculture was reaching its psychedelic zenith. Manson, with his jailhouse guitar and his strange, hypnotic patter, quickly insinuated himself into the scene. He adopted the language of the hippies, speaking of love, freedom, and enlightenment, but he twisted those concepts into something darker, something that served his own insatiable need for power. He began gathering followers, almost by accident at first, a lost young girl here, a runaway boy there, each one drawn to his intensity, his promise of a family, a tribe. A place where they truly belonged. He told them he was a guru, a prophet, a man who understood the deep truths of the universe. And they believed him because they wanted so badly to believe in something, and because he was a master at finding the cracks in their souls and pouring his poison inside. One of the first to fall under his spell was Mary Brunner, a gentle, soft-spoken librarian at the University of California, Berkeley. She met Manson on a sunny afternoon in Haight-Ashbury, and within days she had quit her job and invited him to move into her apartment. She became his first real follower, the mother of one of his children, and the template for the women who would later become his devoted family. Soon after came Lynette Fromm, a wiry, red-haired teenager with a dancer's body and a heart full of longing, who would later be known as Squeaky. She was followed by Susan Atkins, a dark-haired, intense young woman with a history of rebellion and a desperate need for direction. And then there was Patricia Krenwinkel, a tall, insecure girl from an upper-middle-class family in Los Angeles, who had been drifting through life feeling unloved and invisible until Manson found her and told her she was special. The family, as they began to call themselves, was not just a group of followers. It was a mobile, organic entity that existed entirely at Manson's whim. He took them on the road, traveling up and down the California coast in a ramshackle old-school bus painted black, living off handouts, petty crime. And the money the girls could bring in through panhandling and occasional prostitution. Manson taught them that conventional morality was a prison, that society's rules were lies designed to keep them enslaved. He preached a philosophy of total freedom, but the freedom he offered was a mirage, because in the world of the family, Manson's word was law. He decided who slept with whom, who ate, who was punished, and who was rewarded. He orchestrated orgies that blurred the lines of intimacy and control, using sex as a tool to bind his followers more tightly to him and to break down the last vestiges of their individual identities. By the spring of 1968, the family had swelled to a couple of dozen members, a shifting cast of lost souls who had surrendered their wills to the man they called Charlie. They settled for a time in a remote ranch in the mountains outside Los Angeles, but their most infamous base of operations would be the Spawn Movie Ranch. A decaying old Western movie set nestled in the rugged hills of Chatsworth, just north of the San Fernando Valley. The ranch was owned by an old, nearly blind man named George Spahn, who made a living renting out horses and allowing film crews to use the dusty, false-fronted buildings for B-movie westerns and television shows. Manson recognized the ranch as the perfect hideout, isolated, sprawling, and largely ignored by the outside world. He made a deal with Spahn, an arrangement that involved the girls of the family attending to the old man's needs, cooking his meals, cleaning his shack, and, according to some accounts, providing sexual favors in exchange for rent-free occupancy. Spawn Ranch became the crucible in which the family's dark transformation was completed. Here, amid the tumbleweeds and the weathered saloon doors, Manson's philosophy grew increasingly apocalyptic. He had always been a voracious reader, consuming everything from the Bible to science fiction to self-help manuals, and in the isolation of the ranch. He began to weave these disparate threads into a bizarre, terrifying prophecy. He called it Helter Skelter, a phrase he had taken from the Beatles' White Album, which had been released in late 1968 and which Manson had listened to obsessively. Convinced that the songs contained secret messages directed at him personally. In Manson's fevered interpretation, Helter Skelter was a coming race war. An apocalyptic conflict between black and white that would destroy society and leave a handful of survivors cowering in underground hideouts. The family, he declared, would be among those survivors, and when the war was over and the black man had emerged victorious but proved incapable of governing, the family would emerge from the bottomless pit mentioned in the Book of Revelation and take their rightful place as the rulers of a new world. Manson would be the Messiah, and his followers would be his chosen ones. To understand how a man could convince a group of intelligent, albeit damaged, young people to accept such madness as gospel, one must understand the power of the environment he created. The ranch was a closed system, a total institution just as surely as any prison. Manson cut his followers off from the outside world, from their families, from any sources of information that might contradict his teachings. He used sleep deprivation, psychedelic drugs, particularly LSD, and constant group pressure to erode their resistance and reshape their perceptions of reality. He would launch into long, rambling monologues that ranged from biblical exegesis to paranoid rants about the establishment, and the followers would sit at his feet, their eyes glazed with devotion, absorbing every word. He told them that death was not real, that murder was just a way of releasing the soul from its earthly prison, and that they, as the enlightened ones, had a duty to help bring about Helter Skelter by committing acts of violence that would spark the war. Tensions on the ranch began to simmer as Manson's frustration grew. He was obsessed with becoming a rock star, and through a series of chance connections, he had managed to gain access to the fringes of the Hollywood music scene. A young musician named Dennis Wilson, drummer for the enormously popular Beach Boys, had picked up two hitchhiking girls one afternoon, Ella Jo Bailey and Patricia Krenwinkel, and brought them back to his Sunset Boulevard mansion. When Wilson returned home from a recording session later that day, he found his house teeming with strange, long-haired hippies, and in the driveway, a decrepit school bus. At the center of the chaos was a small, wiry man with piercing eyes who introduced himself as Charlie. Wilson was initially charmed by Manson and his followers, even recording a song Manson had written, retitled "Never Learn Not to Love," for the Beach Boys. But as Manson's demands for money, recognition, and access grew increasingly aggressive, Wilson distanced himself, leaving Manson enraged and humiliated. Another chance connection led Manson to a young music producer named Terry Melcher, the son of Doris Day, who lived at 10,050 CeeLo Drive. Melcher had visited Spawn Ranch, heard Manson play, and expressed a vague interest in helping him record an album. Manson believed, with the desperate certainty of a man on the edge, that Melcher was his ticket to fame and fortune. But Melcher, like Wilson before him, eventually pulled away, disturbed by the strangeness of the family and the unsettling intensity of Manson himself. For Manson, this rejection was a cosmic betrayal, a sign that the world was conspiring against him, and the rage inside him curdled into something murderous. The house on CeeLo Drive, with its wealthy, successful occupants, became a symbol of everything he despised, everything the family was fighting against. Everything that had to be destroyed if Helter Skelter was to begin. As the summer of 1969 grew hotter, life at Spawn Ranch descended into a state of siege mentality. Manson convinced his followers that the black revolutionaries known as the Black Panthers were both a threat and the unwitting instruments of his prophecy. He armed the family with guns and knives, holding drills in the dusty canyons, preparing for the war that he believed was imminent. He spoke of pigs, the establishment, the rich, the police, and how they had to be slaughtered to provoke the chaos that would set Helter Skelter in motion. The word he used, pig, would soon be written in blood on the walls of a silent house in Benedict Canyon, a grotesque signature that would terrify the world. The night of August 8, 1969, was a Friday. Up at Spawn Ranch, the air was thick with tension. Manson had been brooding for days, his mood dark and unpredictable. He called a meeting of his most trusted followers, the ones who had proven their absolute loyalty, the ones who would do anything he asked without question. Among them were Charles "Tex" Watson, a handsome, clean-cut Texan who had abandoned a promising college career to follow Manson; Susan Atkins, whose cruel streak had grown more pronounced under Manson's tutelage; Patricia Krenwinkel, the insecure girl who had found a terrifying strength in submission; and a newer recruit, Linda Kasabian, a young mother on the run from a troubled marriage, who would become the getaway driver and the key witness in the days to come. Manson told them the time had come. Helter Skelter was about to begin, and they were to be the instruments of its birth. He selected Tex Watson to lead the mission, giving him a revolver, a bayonet, and a length of nylon rope. He instructed the three women to obey Watson absolutely, and to do whatever was necessary to terrify and destroy the pigs at the house they were going to visit. He himself would not go, he said. He would remain behind to orchestrate the next phase. But he made it clear this was to be a night of violence, a night of blood, a night that would make the world sit up and take notice. The message they were to leave behind was to be shocking, unmistakable, something that would frame the Black Panthers and ignite the firestorm of race war. The car pulled out of the ranch as the sun dipped below the horizon, a battered yellow 1959 Ford that belonged to one of the family members. Inside, the atmosphere was a mixture of fear, excitement, and a kind of hypnotic obedience. Tex Watson drove, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The women sat in silence, their minds washed clean of ordinary morality by months of Manson's teachings. They had been told that their actions were part of a divine plan, that they were soldiers in a cosmic battle, that the people they were about to encounter were less than human. Symbols of a corrupt system that had to be destroyed. And so they traveled through the warm California night, winding up into the quiet hills of Benedict Canyon, toward an address that Terry Melcher had once called home. The house at 10,050 Silo Drive was serene and beautiful in the darkness. Inside, Sharon Tate, heavily pregnant, was hosting a small gathering. Her husband, Roman Polanski, was in London working on a film, and she had invited a few close friends to keep her company. Jay Sebring, the handsome and successful hairstylist, was there, a man who had once been romantically involved with Sharon but had remained a loyal friend. Wojtek Frykowski and Abigail Folger had come over as well, an artistic, free-spirited couple who had been living at the house for several months, house-sitting for Polanski. They drank wine, they smoked marijuana, they listened to music, and they talked about the future, Sharon's baby, the film projects on the horizon, the unfolding adventure of their lives. They had no way of knowing that a nightmare was climbing the hill toward them. Tex Watson parked the car at the bottom of the steep driveway, cutting the engine and the lights. The four of them stepped out into the stillness of the night. The city lights glittered far below, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Watson cut the telephone wires leading to the house, severing the occupants' connection to the outside world. Then they walked up the long, winding drive, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt and gravel. As they approached the gate, they spotted a white Rambler parked just outside, its headlights still on, the engine idling. Inside sat Stephen Parent, the 18-year-old friend of the caretaker, who had been visiting William Garretson and was about to leave. He had been a boy with a passion for electronics, a quiet, unassuming kid who had crossed paths with death purely by chance. Tex Watson approached the car, his face a mask of calm determination. He raised the revolver, a .22 caliber high standard, and without a word, shot Stephen Parent 4 times through the windshield and side window. The boy died almost instantly, his body crumpling onto the front seat. The engine continued to run, its mechanical hum a surreal counterpoint to the sudden, shocking violence. This was the first blood spilled that night, but it would not be the last. Watson cut a screen on a window and climbed into the house, opening the front door from the inside to let the women in. They slipped into the living room where the guests were still talking and laughing, unaware of the death that had already visited their doorstep. Watson shouted at them, waving the gun, ordering them to lie down on the floor. The next few minutes were a chaos of fear and brutality. Jay Sebring, instinctively trying to protect Sharon Tate, lunged toward Watson and was shot in the chest, then brutally stabbed as he fell. Sharon Tate, screaming, begged for her life, for the life of her unborn child, but Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel held her down while Tex Watson stabbed her repeatedly. According to the testimony that would later emerge, Susan Atkins leaned close to Sharon Tate as she died, and when the actress cried out for her mother, Atkins replied, coldly and without a trace of pity, "Look, bitch, I have no mercy for you. You're going to die and you'd better get used to it." The scene was one of unimaginable horror. Wojtek Frykowski, a powerfully built man, fought back with desperate fury, but he was overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the attack. He was stabbed over 50 times and bludgeoned with the butt of the revolver so hard that the gun itself broke. Abigail Folger managed to run from the house, her white nightgown billowing behind her, but Patricia Krenwinkel and Tex Watson pursued her across the lawn. She was caught and stabbed repeatedly, her body left lying in the dew-soaked grass, a few feet from where a flagstone path curved toward the swimming pool. The killers moved through the carnage with a methodical calm, as if they were performing a ritual they had rehearsed 1,000 times. Before they left, Susan Atkins took the blood-soaked towel and wrote the word pig on the front door, a final, taunting signature. Then the four of them climbed back into the Ford, covered in blood, and drove away into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of silence and slaughter that would haunt the world forever. But the night's work was not yet done. Manson's instructions had been precise, but the ferocity of the Silo Drive murders had not been enough to satisfy him. The next night, August 10, he would lead his followers out again, this time to the home of a grocery store executive named Leno LaBianca and his wife, Rosemary. The terror was spreading, and the message was only beginning to be read. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of manipulation, madness, and murder that stretched from the dusty canyons of Spahn Ranch to the glittering heights of Hollywood. A story so bizarre and so chilling that it would become a permanent scar on the American psyche. And at the center of it all, a small, wiry man with an unforgettable name, a man who had turned a generation's dreams of peace and love into a waking nightmare. Watched the news reports from his ranch hideaway and smiled, knowing that Helter Skelter had finally begun. The sun rose on the morning of August 10, 1969, casting its indifferent light over the city of Los Angeles, a city already trembling with a fresh and unfamiliar fear. The news of what had been discovered at 10,050 Silo Drive had ripped through the airwaves like a scream in the night, and the headlines blared with a horror that seemed impossible to comprehend. 5 people brutally slain, one of them a beautiful, pregnant movie star. Her blood used to scrawl a single, taunting word on the front door. The world of the rich and famous, long accustomed to feeling insulated from the violence of the streets by their gates and their privilege, was suddenly, terrifyingly permeable. No one could understand it. There was no robbery, no clear motive, just an ocean of blood and a message that seemed to come from the depths of a nightmare. But up at Spahn Ranch, nestled in the dusty, ragged hills of Chatsworth, the reaction to the news was not horror, but a strange, simmering dissatisfaction. Charles Manson sat cross-legged in the shadow of a decaying western facade, a guitar resting idly on his knee, his dark eyes scanning the newspaper accounts of the previous night's work. He read the reports carefully, his thin lips moving slightly as he absorbed the details. The newspapers were calling it a ritualistic slaughter, a crime of unimaginable brutality, but they were missing the point. They were calling it a tragedy, a mystery, a massacre. They were not calling it what it was supposed to be, the opening salvo of Helter Skelter. The black revolutionaries had not been blamed, the race war had not ignited. The world was not trembling in the grip of the apocalyptic chaos he had prophesied. It was, from Manson's twisted perspective, a failure. He gathered his most trusted followers around him in the stifling heat of the late morning. Tex Watson, still carrying the adrenaline and the bloodstains of the previous night beneath his calm exterior, stood nearby, his jaw tight. Susan Atkins, her eyes alight with a dark, unsettling satisfaction, listened with the eagerness of a disciple. Patricia Krenwinkel hovered close, her face a mask of devotion, and Linda Kasabian, the reluctant driver, stood at the edge of the group. Her soul already beginning to fracture under the weight of what she had witnessed. Manson told them in that soft, hypnotic voice of his that they had not been thorough enough. The message had not been clear. The world was too stupid, too blind, to understand what they had done unless they were shown, with absolute and unmistakable clarity, what the new order demanded. He told them they would go out again that very night, and this time, he would go with them to show them exactly how it was supposed to be done. The day passed in a haze of tension and preparation. Manson selected the team for the night's mission. Tex Watson would once again be the muscle, the instrument of death. Patricia Krenwinkel and Susan Atkins, the hardened soldiers of the family, would join him, and a new girl was to be initiated into the inner circle of blood, Leslie Van Houten. Leslie was 19 years old, a former homecoming princess with a sweet face and an all-American smile that belied the profound emptiness she felt inside. She had been with the family for a relatively short time, but she had thrown herself into its rituals with the fervor of a true believer, and Manson had decided she was ready. She was to prove her loyalty this night, to cross a line from which there could be no return. The monster who had once been a pretty, popular girl from a broken home in Monrovia, California, would this night help to carve a name for herself into the darkest annals of crime. As evening fell, the sky above the San Fernando Valley turned the color of a bruised plum, and the lights of the city began to flicker on, one by one. Charles Manson climbed into the passenger seat of an old, battered car, a stolen 1952 Ford, and instructed his followers to get in. They drove down from the ranch, out of the rugged hills, and into the flat, sprawling grid of suburban Los Angeles. Manson directed Watson through the streets, his voice calm and detached, as if he were guiding a tour. They drove for what seemed like hours, through neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent, the houses larger, the lawns greener. Manson was searching for a suitable target, a symbol of the establishment that needed to be torn down. He had a peculiar, almost animal instinct for finding the homes of those who embodied the comfortable, materialistic world he so deeply resented. At some point in the evening, Manson's wandering eye settled on a house at 3301 Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz district. It was a pleasant, unassuming Spanish-style home with a well-kept yard, the kind of place where a successful, hard-working couple might settle down to enjoy the fruits of their labor. The house belonged to Leno LaBianca and his wife, Rosemary. Leno was a self-made man, the owner of a chain of grocery stores, a man who had built a prosperous life through sheer determination and hard work. Rosemary was a stylish woman who ran her own dress shop, a boutique called the Gate of Venice. They had just returned that evening from a weekend trip to a lake house, and they were settling in for a quiet Sunday night at home. Their 2 children from previous marriages were away, and the house was peaceful, filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. Manson got out of the car and approached the house alone, moving with a ghost-like silence through the darkness. He climbed the fence into the backyard and peered through a window. He saw Leno LaBianca, a man in his 40s, dozing in an armchair, the television flickering softly nearby. The sight seemed to confirm everything Manson needed to know. Here was a pig, a fat, contented symbol of a society that deserved to be washed away in blood. He returned to the car and issued his final instructions. They would enter the house and they would tie up the occupants. But this time, he would show them how to do it, and he would leave them to finish the job with a message that could not be ignored. The followers filed out of the car and approached the house. Tex Watson, carrying a bayonet and a chrome-plated .22 caliber revolver, led the way. The women followed, their faces set in expressions of grim, hypnotized purpose. Manson entered the house first, and when the LaBiancas, startled from their peaceful evening, looked up in terror at the strange, wild-haired man who had materialized in their living room. He spoke to them in a voice that was eerily calm. He told them they would not be hurt, he just needed money and transportation. He used his strange charisma to soothe their panic, even as his followers bound their wrists with leather thongs. Once the couple was secured, Manson took the leather cord and wrapped it around Leno LaBianca's neck, then around Rosemary's, tethering them together in a grotesque parody of matrimonial unity. He then took a pillowcase and placed it over Leno's head and another over Rosemary's so they could not see, but Manson had no intention of robbing them. He had come to send a message, and he had decided that the message would be far more elaborate than a single word scrawled in blood. He took a knife from Tex Watson and stood for a moment, looking down at the bound, trembling figures of the LaBiancas. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving his followers behind. He had done what he came to do. He had orchestrated the scene, he had tied the knots, and now he expected his children to finish the work. He would later tell them with a chilling casualness that they were to do whatever they wanted, but they were to make sure it was spectacular. He climbed into the waiting car with Linda Kasabian and another family member, and they drove away into the night, leaving Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten alone with their victims. What followed was a horror that rivaled, and in some ways exceeded, the butchery of the previous night. Tex Watson turned to Leno LaBianca, who was blind and helpless beneath his pillowcase hood, and began to stab him. The blade of the bayonet plunged into the man's chest and stomach, again and again, with a rhythmic, mechanical fury. Leno fought against his bonds, his muffled screams filling the room, but he was overwhelmed by the sheer savagery of the attack. Watson then took a knife and began to carve into the dying man's exposed chest, etching the letters WAR into his flesh. Blood pooled on the floor, spreading in dark, shining pools across the carpet. When the killing was done, Watson took a knife and fork from the kitchen and jammed the fork into Leno's stomach, leaving the utensils protruding grotesquely from the corpse. A pillowcase was pulled down over the dead man's head, and the cord around his neck was tightened one final time. In another part of the house, the women had descended upon Rosemary LaBianca. She had been a strong, elegant woman, but she was no match for the feral energy that now engulfed her. Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten held her down while Susan Atkins, brandishing a knife, began to stab her. But the task of killing Rosemary fell most heavily on the two younger women, who plunged their blades into her body with a terrifying frenzy. Her nightgown was torn, her blood spattering the walls. Krenwinkel, in a state of demonic inspiration, grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed Rosemary repeatedly, the blade penetrating her torso, her back, her arms. Later at her trial, Krenwinkel would describe the act with a chilling detachment, saying that the knife seemed to go into the woman with surprising ease, and that the more she stabbed, the more she felt the woman was not a person at all, just a mannequin, a thing to be destroyed. As Rosemary LaBianca lay dying, one of the women wrapped an electrical cord around her neck and pulled it tight, and then came the message. This time the killers did not simply scrawl a single word and flee. They took the blood of their victims and they painted the walls of the home with a manifesto of madness. On the refrigerator door in smeared, dripping letters, they wrote HEALTER, a misspelled version of Manson's apocalyptic prophecy. On the living room wall, they wrote death to pigs. And on another wall, the single, chilling word rise. The message was a tapestry of delusion, a grotesque attempt to frame the Black Panthers and ignite the race war that Manson had been raving about for months. The killers then slipped out of the house, leaving behind a tableau so macabre, so saturated with symbolic violence, that it would haunt the dreams of the police officers who discovered it for the rest of their lives. The morning after the LaBianca murders, the sun rose over Los Angeles to find a city that had not yet connected the new horror with the one that had been discovered just a day earlier. The bodies were found by Leno's son, Frank Struthers, who had been surfing the previous day and had come home to check on the couple. He found the front door slightly ajar and walked into a scene of unspeakable carnage. His father's body, the word war carved into his chest, the knife and fork in his abdomen. His stepmother's body bound and brutalized, the walls smeared with bloody slogans that made no sense. The police arrived, a different division from the one handling the Tate case, and for a crucial period of time, the two investigations ran on parallel tracks. Neither precinct aware that they were hunting the same pack of killers. The Tate murders were being investigated by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the LAPD's elite robbery homicide division, while the LaBianca case fell to the LAPD's Northeast Division. The lack of communication, the vast and fragmented nature of the department, and the sheer unprecedented brutality of the crimes allowed the killers to remain hidden for weeks. At Spawn Ranch, life went on with an increasingly frantic edge. Manson continued to preach his prophecy of helter-skelter, but the paranoia was growing. The family had obtained a small arsenal of guns, and they had started patrolling the perimeters of the ranch, convinced that the Black Panthers were going to launch an assault upon them. Manson had told his followers that the war was coming and that they would be the first to be attacked, a test of their righteousness. In reality, the only force closing in on them was the law, and it was approaching from an unexpected direction. The August 16 raid on Spawn Ranch by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, executed as part of a massive auto theft investigation, netted a cache of stolen dune buggies, machine guns, and other weapons. Manson and many of his followers were arrested, but they were released a few days later on a technicality involving a misstated search warrant. The close call only heightened the messianic fervor within the group, convincing them that they were divinely protected, but the cracks were beginning to show. Linda Kasabian, the young mother who had driven the getaway car on both nights of murder, was crumbling under the weight of her conscience. She had watched Stephen Parent shot dead, she had seen Sharon Tate's desperate, pregnant body crumple to the floor, and she had heard the screams of Rosemary LaBianca. Every night, the images replayed behind her eyelids. She became increasingly erratic, unable to reconcile the gentle, loving rhetoric of the counterculture she had once embraced with the sea of blood in which she was now drowning. Eventually, after an argument with Manson, she slipped away from the ranch and fled, eventually making her way to her mother's home in New Hampshire. She would later become the most critical witness in the case, the one person who could bring the horror out of the shadows and into the light of a courtroom. The investigation into the murders might have dragged on for months, or even longer, had it not been for the arrogant, blundering mouth of Susan Atkins. While incarcerated at the Sybil Brand Institute for Women on the auto theft charges from the ranch raid, Atkins began to talk. She was housed with a woman named Virginia Graham, a savvy, streetwise inmate who listened in growing horror as the dark-haired girl with the cold eyes began to boast about the family's exploits. Atkins, craving attention and validation, spoke with a kind of perverse pride about the night at CeeLo Drive. She described how Sharon Tate had begged for her life and the life of her baby, and how she had looked the dying woman in the eye and told her she had no mercy. She described the feeling of the knife, the taste of the blood, the rush of power. She talked about how they had written pig on the door in Sharon Tate's own blood. Virginia Graham listened, memorizing every word, and then she told another inmate, Ronnie Howard, who also heard the confessions. Together, they went to the authorities. The information was passed to the Los Angeles Police Department, and the pieces began, slowly at first, then with a sudden, terrifying rush to fall into place. Detectives from the Tate investigation, led by Lieutenant Paul LePage and Sergeant Mike McGann, traveled to Sybil Brand to interview Atkins. At first, she was coy, evasive, but the detectives had the details now, the specific, non-public details that only the killers could know. They knew about the white rope, the manner of the bindings, the precise words written on the door. Confronted with the evidence of her own loose tongue, Atkins finally began to talk. She gave them names: Charles Manson, Charles Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten. She gave them the story of Helter Skelter, the twisted philosophy that had driven them to kill. And she confirmed what the detectives had only begun to suspect, that the Tate and LaBianca murders were linked, the work of the same savage, mindless hand, directed by the same twisted mind. The investigation now exploded into a massive, multi-jurisdictional manhunt. Manson and the core members of the family had vanished from Spawn Ranch, having burned the stolen dune buggies and fled into the vast, empty deserts of Death Valley. They had taken refuge at another remote hideout, the Barker Ranch, a desolate, sun-scorched outpost on the edge of the national park. It was there, on October 12, 1969, that a joint force of the California Highway Patrol and the Inyo County Sheriff's Office, acting on a tip about the auto theft ring, raided the ranch. They found a group of ragged, feral-looking young people living in squalor, stealing cars and motorcycles, surviving on what they could scavenge. Among them, they found a young woman named Catherine Scher and hiding in a small cabinet beneath the bathroom sink, a small, wiry man with wild eyes and a matted beard. He was pulled out by his hair, spitting and cursing, a creature of pure, undiluted rage. Charles Manson was in custody, and with him, the dark heart of the family was torn from the desert and delivered into the hands of justice. The arrests that followed over the next few weeks rounded up the key players. Charles Tex Watson had already fled to his native Texas, but he was apprehended in McKinney and extradited back to California after a lengthy legal battle. Patricia Krenwinkel was found living in a welfare hotel in Mobile, Alabama, where she had been working as a waitress, her hair cut short, trying to vanish into the anonymity of the working poor. Leslie Van Houten was brought in from a remote cabin in the mountains. Susan Atkins was already behind bars. And Linda Kasabian, the frightened, guilt-ridden young woman who had driven the car and watched the slaughter, surrendered to the police in New Hampshire and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. The family was shattered, its members scattered across the country, but their nightmare was about to be resurrected in the cold, glaring light of a Los Angeles courtroom. The trial that began in June 1970, officially known as the People of the State of California v. Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, was a media circus unlike anything the American judicial system had ever seen. The spectacle unfolded on the 8th floor of the Los Angeles County Hall of Justice, a cavernous, wood-paneled courtroom that would become the stage for a drama of madness, manipulation, and murder. Presiding over it all was Judge Charles H. Older, a former Army colonel and fighter pilot, a stern, silver-haired man whose patience would be tested to its absolute limits. The lead prosecutor was Vincent Bugliosi, a brilliant, fastidious, an intensely driven young deputy district attorney who would devote nearly 2 years of his life to making sure that Charles Manson and his followers would never walk free again. From the very first day of jury selection, Manson and the women turned the trial into a terrifying piece of street theater. They arrived in court with shaved heads, a practice they had begun the day before the trial opened as a show of solidarity and a deliberate strategy to unnerve and disconcert the proceedings. Manson himself had carved an X into his forehead during an earlier hearing, a scar that he would later, with grim irony, modify into a swastika. The women followed suit, each marking their own foreheads with a bloody X, sitting in the courtroom with their heads bowed, chanting in low, guttural tones, their eyes rolling back in their heads. They were not defendants in the usual sense. They were a cult performing a ritual, and they intended to dominate the narrative just as Manson had dominated their lives. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the testimony of Linda Kasabian, and her days on the stand were among the most electrifying and emotionally harrowing in the history of American jurisprudence. She sat in the witness box, a pale, fragile figure with long, dark hair parted in the middle, and in a soft, trembling voice, she recounted the events of August 8 and August 10, 1969. In excruciating detail. She described the drive up to CeeLo Drive, the shooting of Stephen Parent, the screams from inside the house, and the sight of Tex Watson emerging, drenched in blood, to tell her that he had done it. That they were all dead. She described the night at the La Bianca house, how she had stayed in the car while the others went inside, and how she had heard, even from the street, the muffled sounds of terror and death. The courtroom was silent, rapt as she spoke, the jurors' faces pale with shock. Manson sat at the defense table, his eyes burning into her, his lips moving in silent, venomous curses. At one point, he turned to the jury and slowly drew his finger across his throat in a gesture of unmistakable menace. The defense, led by attorneys like Irving Kanerk, who represented Manson, employed a strategy of delay, obstruction, and chaos. Kanerk, a notorious courtroom brawler, objected to virtually every question, engaged in endless, rambling cross-examinations, and seemed determined to turn the trial into a procedural nightmare. The women, for their part, attempted to recant their earlier confessions and declare that Linda Kasabian was the real mastermind, a lie so transparent that it crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The blood-scrawled words, the broken gun, the rope. The testimony of the police officers and the jailhouse informants, it all painted a picture of complicity and premeditated slaughter that was impossible to dismiss. And throughout it all, the specter of helter-skelter loomed over the proceedings, the bizarre, apocalyptic motive that Vincent Bugliosi painstakingly reconstructed for the jury, explaining how a failed musician's twisted interpretation of a Beatles album could lead to the brutal deaths of 7 innocent people. The trial stretched on for 9.5 months, the longest murder trial in American history up to that point. The defendants screamed at the judge, threw themselves at the bench, and disrupted the proceedings with every weapon at their disposal. Manson, at one point, leaped over the defense table with a sharpened pencil aimed at Judge Older's throat, only to be tackled by bailiffs before he could reach his target. The women would sit in the courtroom and croon Beatles songs under their breath, their eyes alight with a fervor that seemed, to outside observers, utterly demonic. The jury was sequestered, living in a hotel, cut off from their families, the pressure of the case bearing down on them like a weight that would never lift. On January 15, 1971, the jury began its deliberations. They spent 9 days reviewing the mountains of evidence and the thousands of pages of testimony. On January 25, they returned their verdicts. The courtroom was packed, tense, the air thick with anticipation. The clerk read the names, and for each defendant on each count of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, the word came back: guilty, guilty, guilty. The defendants sat impassively, their faces blank, their shaved heads gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Outside the courthouse, a handful of Manson's remaining followers, the ones who had not been arrested, kept a vigil, their foreheads carved with X's, chanting and singing. A ghostly remnant of the family that would never quite die. The penalty phase followed, and on March 29, 1971, the jury sentenced all 4 defendants to death in the gas chamber. The verdicts were met with a strange, hollow silence. Manson, when asked if he had anything to say, launched into a rambling, incoherent monologue about the death of his ego and the prison that was society, a speech that made sense only to him. He was taken from the courtroom, his arms shackled behind his back, and the doors of San Quentin's death row swung open to receive him. But the story did not end there. In February 1972, in a sweeping decision that reshaped the landscape of American criminal justice, the California Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional, commuting the sentences of all death row inmates to life in prison. The gas chamber that had awaited Charles Manson and his followers would never be lit for them. They were transferred to the general prison population, where they would begin the long, slow, dark march of decades behind bars. For the next 45 years, Charles Manson remained a name that symbolized the absolute, unfathomable depths of human depravity. He became a grim cultural fixture, a face on t-shirts, a boogeyman for a generation that had lost its innocence. From his cell at Corcoran State Prison, he granted occasional interviews, his once intense eyes growing ever more wild and unfocused, his ramblings growing more disjointed with each passing year. He would speak about the environment, about the Beatles, about the young women who still wrote him love letters, his mind a labyrinth of delusion from which there was no exit. He was denied parole 12 times, each hearing a macabre ritual in which he would refuse to participate, or would show up to recite bizarre, unrelated monologues. The women of the family, too, grew old behind bars. Susan Atkins, who had spoken with such cold, cruel clarity on the stand, succumbed to brain cancer in 2009 after serving 38 years of her sentence. Leslie Van Houten, the one-time homecoming princess, became a model prisoner, earning degrees and counseling other inmates. Her bids for parole repeatedly denied by the families of the victims who remembered, with undimmed grief, the horror she had helped to inflict. Patricia Krenwinkel, the awkward, insecure girl who had stabbed Rosemary LaBianca with such terrifying fury, remained incarcerated, the longest-serving female inmate in California history. Charles Tex Watson, who had found religion behind bars and become an ordained minister, ran a prison ministry. His website broadcasting sermons to the outside world while the families of Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Leno LaBianca, and Rosemary LaBianca lived with the wounds that never healed. And Charles Manson himself, the malignant, manipulative heart of it all, finally died on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83, of cardiac arrest brought on by respiratory failure. His body went unclaimed for months, a final, pathetic echo of the abandoned child he had once been, the boy whose mother had traded him for a pitcher of beer. There was no funeral, no marker, no monument. His ashes were scattered, reportedly, by the one acolyte who still carried his flame, and the world was left to reflect on the unfathomable mystery of how such a small, broken man could cast such a long, dark shadow over the history of a nation. The legacy of the Manson family murders is not merely a story of blood and madness. It is a scar on the American soul, a moment when the utopian dreams of the 1960s curdled into nightmare. The counterculture, with its emphasis on free love, communal living, and the rejection of authority, had contained within it the seeds of something beautiful, but also, in its most extreme and vulnerable corners, the potential for manipulation and destruction. Charles Manson exploited every fissure in the social fabric. He took the language of peace and twisted it into a justification for war. He took the yearning for family and turned it into a prison of the mind. He took the desire for transcendence and drowned it in blood. The house at 10,050 Silo Drive was torn down, erased from the landscape as if the very ground were cursed. A new mansion with a new address now sits on the site, and the driveway where Stephen Parent died is lined with manicured hedges. But the memory lingers, a ghost that cannot be exorcised. The story of Sharon Tate, whose beauty and kindness were extinguished just as she stood on the threshold of motherhood, remains a piercing reminder of the fragility of life and the randomness of evil. The photographs of her smile, her radiant, pregnant glow, are forever juxtaposed with the word pig scrawled in her blood, a collision of innocence and depravity that defies comprehension. And yet within the horror there is the testimony of those who endured. The families of the victims, who channeled their unimaginable grief into advocacy for victims' rights, transforming their private sorrow into public good. The prosecutors and detectives who refused to let the case go cold, who pieced together the puzzle of helter-skelter with painstaking diligence and brought a monstrous conspiracy to justice. The surviving members of the family, like Linda Kasabian, who found the courage to break free from Manson's spell and tell the truth, no matter how damning to herself. Their stories are the counternote to the darkness, the proof that even in the face of the most profound evil, the human capacity for resilience and for justice endures. As the years have passed, the Manson murders have been endlessly dissected, analyzed, and fictionalized, but the core of the tragedy remains stubbornly, terrifyingly simple. A man with a black hole where his soul should have been gathered, a collection of lost, broken young people, and through a toxic alchemy of charisma and cruelty, transformed them into instruments of slaughter. The fact that it happened is a warning that echoes down the decades. The monsters we fear do not always come from outside. Sometimes they are homegrown, their evil woven from the threads of neglect, abuse, and the desperate, all-too-human need to belong. The summer of 1969 ended, and the world moved on, but the question that Charles Manson left behind, the question of how a man can command such darkness, and how a society can fail to see it growing in its midst, still waits, unanswered, in the quiet shadows of every new generation. The years that followed the trial and sentencing of Charles Manson and his co-defendants were meant to be a time of closure, a slow, steady turning of the page on a chapter of such profound darkness that the world was eager to consign it to the past. But the Manson case, like a wound that refused to heal, kept revealing new layers of infection, new depths of depravity that the original investigation had only begun to plumb. For if the summer of 1969 had taught the world anything, it was that the family's capacity for violence was not a sudden eruption, but a calculated, methodical campaign. And the bodies discovered at Silo Drive and Waverly Drive were only the most visible peaks of a submerged mountain of terror. The full scope of what Charles Manson and his followers had done was still buried, sometimes literally, in the remote canyons and desert wastes of California, waiting for the passage of time and the stubborn persistence of detectives to bring it into the light. The first hint that the Tate LaBianca murders were not isolated incidents came into focus with the investigation into the death of a man named Gary Hinman, a gentle, struggling music teacher and graduate student who lived in a modest house in Topanga Canyon. Hinman's murder, which occurred in late July of 1969, just 2 weeks before the slaughter at Silo Drive, was initially investigated as a separate case. A botched drug ripoff that had spiraled into lethal violence. But as the detectives working the Manson case began to connect the threads, a far more sinister pattern emerged. Gary Hinman had been a kind and generous soul, a hippie in the truest sense of the word, who had opened his home to the drifting, the lost, and the strange. He had crossed paths with the Manson family months before, providing them with a place to crash, sharing his meager possessions, and believing in his naive and trusting way that he was helping a community of free spirits. But Charles Manson saw Hinman differently. To Manson, Hinman was a mark, a source of money that the family desperately needed to fund their arsenal and their exodus to the desert. Manson believed that Hinman had recently inherited a sum of money, a rumor that may or may not have been true, but in the echo chamber of the family's paranoia, it became an established fact. On July 25, 1969, Manson dispatched Bobby Bosolil, a handsome, dark-haired musician and one of the earliest and most committed members of the family, to Hinman's home with instructions to extract the money by any means necessary. Accompanying Bosolil were Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner, the two women who had been with Manson from the very beginning. Their loyalty absolute and their consciences long since cauterized by his teachings. The scene that unfolded inside the little Topanga Canyon house over the next 3 days was a grotesque prelude to the horrors of August. Bosolil and the women confronted Hinman, demanding the money he insisted he did not have. When gentle persuasion and intimidation failed, the situation escalated into a nightmare of sustained torture. Charles Manson himself arrived at the house, drawn by reports that Hinman was resisting. It was there, according to the testimony and confessions that would later emerge, that Manson took a sword and sliced off a piece of Gary Hinman's ear. An act of mutilation that foreshadowed the savagery to come. The music teacher was held captive in his own home, beaten, starved, and terrorized, all for a phantom inheritance that likely never existed. And through it all, the killers listened to music, ate food from Hinman's refrigerator, and treated the slow, agonizing death of a human being as if it were a mundane chore. On July 27, after 3 days of torment, Bobby Bosolil finally stabbed Gary Hinman to death, plunging a knife into his chest and ending his suffering. But the murder was not enough. Just as they would do a month later at Silo Drive, the killers felt compelled to leave a message. Bosolil dipped his hand in Hinman's blood and wrote the words "political piggy" on the living room wall. A taunting signature designed to implicate the Black Panthers and ignite the racial conflagration of Helter Skelter. He also drew a panther paw print, a deliberate, clumsy attempt to frame the militant group. Bosolil then fled the scene in Hinman's car, which was later found abandoned with a bloody knife inside. He was arrested on August 6, 1969, just 2 days before the Silo Drive massacre, and was sitting in a jail cell when the news of the Sharon Tate murders broke. The connection between the crimes, obscured at first by the sheer volume of chaos, would eventually become undeniable, linking the family to a killing spree that began weeks before the world had even heard the name Charles Manson. The death of Gary Hinman was not the only murder that lurked in the shadows of the family's history. As the investigation into Spahn Ranch intensified, detectives began to hear rumors about another man who had vanished, a ranch hand named Donald Jerome Shee, known to everyone simply as Shorty. Shorty Shee was a large, affable, red-haired man with a quick temper and a complicated relationship with the family. He had worked at Spahn Ranch for years, a reliable wrangler who could mend a fence, shoe a horse, and keep the old Western movie sets from crumbling into dust. When Manson and his followers arrived, Shorty initially tolerated them, even developing a wary friendship with some of the women. But as the summer of 1969 wore on and the family grew more insular, more armed, and more openly hostile to outsiders, Shorty's position became precarious. He made the mistake of expressing his disgust at the way Manson treated the women, and he made an even greater mistake. He let it be known that he might talk to the police if things got too far out of hand. In the paranoid universe of the Manson family, a potential snitch was an existential threat. Manson had long preached that those who betrayed the family would be eliminated, and Shorty Shee, by his own careless words, had signed his death warrant. The opportunity to carry out the execution came in the chaotic days following the Spahn Ranch raid on August 16. A raid that had been motivated by auto theft, but which had only reinforced Manson's belief that the establishment was closing in. The family needed to flee, but before they disappeared into the desert, they had to clean house. Sometime around August 26, 1969, Shorty Shee was lured to a remote part of the ranch by Manson and a group of his most loyal followers, including Tex Watson, Clem Grogan, and Bruce Davis. They told him they needed help with a broken-down car, a ruse that the trusting ranch hand accepted. When Shorty arrived at the designated spot, the mask dropped. Charles Manson himself attacked first, slicing Shorty across the face with a machete, the blade biting deep into his flesh. The big man fought back with desperate strength, but he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of his assailants. Tex Watson stabbed him, and Bruce Davis, a sandy-haired drifter who had become one of Manson's most devoted acolytes, joined in the butchery. They stabbed him, bludgeoned him, and when he finally lay still, they dragged his body into a shallow grave. But the savagery did not end with death. Fearing that Shorty's body might be discovered, the killers later returned to the grave, exhumed the corpse, and, in an act of macabre thoroughness, dismembered it, scattering the remains in multiple locations across the rugged, sun-baked hills. For years, the exact whereabouts of Shorty Shee remained a mystery, a ghost story whispered among those who knew the dark secrets of Spawn Ranch. It was not until 1977, nearly 8 years after the murder, that the truth finally emerged from the dry earth. Acting on information provided by one of the participants, authorities conducted an extensive excavation at the ranch and unearthed the first of Shorty Shee's bones. The discovery was a grim vindication for the detectives who had long believed that the family's body count extended far beyond the 7 officially recognized victims. The subsequent trials for the Shee murder resulted in the convictions of Charles Manson, Tex Watson, Bruce Davis, and Clem Grogan, the latter of whom cooperated with authorities and led them to the burial sites. The sentencing added more decades to their already interminable prison terms, but for the families of the victims, and for a public still grappling with the enormity of the family's crimes, it was one more piece of a puzzle that seemed to have no bottom. The revelation of these additional murders cast a long shadow over the post-conviction narrative, transforming the story of the Manson family from a singular, inexplicable outbreak of violence into a sustained campaign of terror that had gone largely unchecked during the summer of 1969. But the darkness did not end with the incarceration of the killers. The family, as a social organism, had never been solely dependent on physical proximity to its leader. Its tendrils extended into the outside world through a network of devoted followers who had not participated directly in the murders, but who remained utterly enslaved to Manson's will. These acolytes maintained a constant vigil outside the courthouse during the trial, their heads shaved, their foreheads carved with X's, their voices raised in eerie, discordant chants. And among them, the most fanatical, the most dangerous, was a young woman named Lynette Fromm. Lynette Alice Fromm, known to everyone as Squeaky, had been with Manson since the early days in Haight-Ashbury. She was not involved in the Tate LaBianca murders. She had been back at the ranch, part of the supporting cast that kept the family running. But her devotion to Charlie was perhaps the most absolute of any of his followers. She had adopted his rambling, apocalyptic philosophy with a fervent, unblinking intensity, and when the trial ended and her beloved leader was locked away in a concrete tomb, she transferred her messianic obsession onto the task of keeping his message alive. She and her close companion, Sandra Good, became a permanent fixture in the public spaces around the Sacramento and Los Angeles courthouses, handing out pamphlets, haranguing passers-by, and warning of the environmental catastrophes that Manson had prophesied. Manson's philosophy had, by this time, mutated into a bizarre eco-apocalyptic creed he called ATWA, an acronym that stood for air, trees, water, animals. He believed that the planet was a living entity, and that humanity was a cancer that needed to be cut out to restore balance. It was a strange, twisted echo of the environmental movement that was just beginning to take root in mainstream consciousness, and for Squeaky Fromm, it became a holy war. She watched from her squalid apartment as the redwood forests of Northern California were logged, as the air grew thick with smog, and as the political establishment, embodied most visibly by the President of the United States, did nothing to stop the destruction. In her fractured mind, the logic was inescapable. The system had to be confronted, and the most powerful symbol of that system was Gerald Ford. On the morning of September 5, 1975, President Ford was in Sacramento, the capital of California, to deliver a speech to the state legislature. The morning was bright and clear, the kind of California day that promised nothing but pleasantness. The president left his hotel, the Senator Hotel, and walked across the street toward the Capitol building, his aides and Secret Service agents forming a loose, watchful cordon around him. The crowd that had gathered to see him was cheerful and curious, a typical mix of tourists, supporters, and the merely inquisitive. Among them, wearing a flowing red robe and concealing a heavy .45 caliber Colt semi-automatic pistol in a holster strapped to her thigh, stood Squeaky Fromm. She had been stalking the president for several days, attending his public events, testing the boundaries of the security perimeters. Her mind a cauldron of Manson's teachings and her own escalating desperation. As Ford emerged from the hotel and paused to wave at the crowd, Squeaky pushed her way through the onlookers, her slight frame and disarming. Childlike face allowing her to penetrate closer than anyone expected. She was just a few feet away when she drew the pistol from beneath her robe and leveled it at the President of the United States. The weapon was aimed directly at his midsection. She pulled the trigger and nothing happened. The hammer of the .45 snapped forward, but the chamber was empty. In her frantic preparations, Squeaky had failed to chamber a round, an oversight that prevented what would have been one of the most seismic assassinations in American history. Secret Service agent Larry Buendorf, a former football player with lightning reflexes, saw the gun, saw the red robe, and lunged at the small woman with a speed born of pure adrenaline. He grabbed the weapon, wrestled it from her hand, and forced her to the ground, his body shielding the president. The crowd erupted in screams and chaos, and within seconds, President Ford was being bundled into the Capitol building, his face pale but his composure intact. Squeaky Fromm, pinned to the pavement, screamed out a single, defiant phrase that echoed Manson's own twisted gospel. It didn't go off, it didn't go off. It wasn't meant to happen. The investigation that followed revealed the depth of the Manson family's lingering influence. Squeaky Fromm was not acting entirely alone. She had been living with Sandra Good and another former family member, and their apartment was a shrine to their imprisoned leader. Filled with Manson's letters, his writings on ATWA, and a dense fog of apocalyptic expectation. At her trial, Squeaky refused to cooperate with her court-appointed attorney and attempted to call Charles Manson as a witness, a maneuver the judge promptly denied. She was convicted of attempted assassination and sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that would see her serving 34 years behind bars before her eventual release on parole in 2009. A frail, aging woman who had spent the entirety of her adult life in the shadow of the man she had once called a prophet. The Fromm assassination attempt was a stark and terrifying reminder that the Manson nightmare had not ended with the guilty verdicts of 1971. The cult-like devotion that Manson had cultivated proved to be remarkably durable, a dark flower that bloomed even in the sterile soil of maximum security prisons. Within the walls of the California Institution for Women at Frontera, where Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were initially incarcerated, the three women maintained a strange, subdued sisterhood. They were segregated from the general population, an island of notoriety within the broader ocean of convicted women. In the early years, they remained defiant, still mouthing Manson's philosophies, and in the case of Atkins, occasionally boasting to other inmates about their crimes. But as the decades passed, the inevitability of their confinement began to work subtle transformations upon them. Transformations that the outside world would observe with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound skepticism. Susan Atkins, the woman who had looked Sharon Tate in the eye and declared she had no mercy, became the first to seek a measure of redemption through religion. She converted to Christianity, renounced Manson, and began to present herself as a changed woman, a remorseful sinner who had been saved by the grace of God. She married twice while in prison, her second husband a man named James Whitehouse, a lawyer who had initially contacted her as part of his studies and then fallen in love. They had married in a prison ceremony in 1987, an event so surreal that it made national headlines, and Atkins spent her remaining decades writing a memoir, giving interviews, and seeking parole. Always insisting that the monster who had killed Sharon Tate was a creature of her distant, drug-addled past. But the parole board and the families of the victims never forgave her. When Atkins was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer in 2008 and her condition rapidly deteriorated, her husband and legal team launched a desperate campaign for compassionate release. They argued that she was a bedridden, paralyzed woman who posed no threat to anyone, that her suffering was immense. and that the basic humanity of allowing her to die in the care of her family should override the punitive demands of the state. The hearings that took place at her bedside were among the most wrenching and controversial in the history of the California penal system. The family of Sharon Tate, led by her sister Deborah, appeared via video link to argue that Susan Atkins had shown no mercy to their beloved sister, had stabbed her as she begged for the life of her unborn child, and that the word compassion had no place in a discussion of her fate. The board, by a vote, denied the release, and Susan Atkins died in the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla on September 24, 2009, at the age of 61. Her body finally succumbing to the cancer that had eaten away at her brain. She died inside as the victims' families had demanded, and her passing was marked not by mourning but by a grim, exhausted satisfaction. Leslie Van Houten, the youngest and perhaps the most psychologically complex of the women, embarked on a different trajectory. Her transformation over the decades was so profound that it became a legal and moral Rorschach test for the entire concept of rehabilitation. Van Houten had been a model prisoner for more than 40 years, earning 2 degrees, completing every counseling program available, and working as a tutor and mentor for other inmates. Psychologists and prison officials testified repeatedly that she posed a minuscule risk of recidivism, that her remorse was genuine, and that the girl who had helped hold down Rosemary LaBianca while Patricia Krenwinkel stabbed her no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The person in prison was a thoughtful, articulate, middle-aged woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to atone for an atrocity she had committed as a brainwashed teenager. The parole board recommended her release multiple times, only to see those recommendations reversed by a succession of governors, most notably Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom, who cited the sheer depravity of the crime and the enduring pain of the victims' families as justification for keeping her behind bars. The LaBianca children, now elderly themselves, appeared at every hearing to recount the horror of discovering their father with a fork protruding from his stomach, their stepmother bound and mutilated. The legal battle became a torturous annual ritual, a public relitigation of the past in which the concepts of justice, mercy, and the limits of redemption were endlessly debated. Finally, in July 2023, after serving more than 53 years in prison, Leslie Van Houten was granted parole without a gubernatorial reversal, and she walked out of the gates a free woman. An event that reignited the entire cultural conversation about the Manson murders and the possibility, if it existed at all, of forgiveness for the unforgivable. Charles Tex Watson, the man who had pulled the trigger on Stephen Parent and plunged the knife into Sharon Tate and Leno LaBianca, underwent his own conversion. One that was simultaneously embraced and condemned by the outside world. While incarcerated at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, Watson experienced a religious awakening that led him to become a born-again Christian and an ordained minister. He founded Abounding Love Ministries, a Christian outreach organization that he operated from behind bars, publishing a website, recording sermons, and corresponding with a vast network of supporters who believed in his redemption. Watson married a woman named Kristen in 1979, and through a series of conjugal family visits permitted by the state before the law was changed, he fathered 4 children. His prison ministry grew into a substantial operation, raising funds and spreading a message of salvation that many found deeply troubling, given the magnitude of his crimes. For the families of the victims, Watson's ministry was an abomination, a way for a mass murderer to rehabilitate his public image without ever truly facing the consequences of his actions. They pointed to the fact that for many years, Watson had refused to discuss the details of the murders, and that his autobiography, Will You Die For Me?, had initially contained what his co-author later described as significant omissions and self-serving distortions. Over time, Watson did provide a more detailed confession, recorded in a series of interviews with his attorney, in which he described the killings with a chilling, matter-of-fact precision that seemed at odds with the gentle, soft-spoken minister he presented to his congregation. He admitted to wrestling with the guilt, to nights spent weeping in his cell, but he also maintained that he had been a puppet of Manson, a man who had lost his soul and then found it again through Christ. The parole board, year after year, listened to his expressions of remorse and consistently denied his release, concluding that the gravity of his offenses outweighed any evidence of rehabilitation. Tex Watson remains in prison to this day, an aging, gray-haired man whose fate is sealed by the unerasable horror of August 1969. And what of Charles Manson himself, the small, swastika-carved gnome who had orchestrated this symphony of blood? The decades of his incarceration were a slow, grotesque descent into a state of near-feral celebrity. He became the most famous prisoner in the American system, a figure who attracted a macabre stream of visitors, journalists, and would-be disciples. From his cell, he granted interviews to major news networks, his rambling monologues a stream of consciousness mixture of environmental prophecy, anti-establishment vitriol, and the same manipulative charm he had deployed in the Haight-Ashbury in 1967. He recorded music, some of which was released on albums that sold to a curious and morbid public. The Gun N' Roses song "Look at Your Game, Girl," a Manson composition, appeared on their 1993 album The Spaghetti Incident, provoking a wave of outrage and controversy that the band brushed off with a mixture of defiance and embarrassment. Manson's physical deterioration was matched by the surreal legal battles that surrounded him, even as he approached the end of his life. In 2014, a 26-year-old woman named Afton Elaine Burton, who went by the name Star, announced that she and Manson were engaged to be married. She had been visiting him for years, a Manson obsessive who had moved to Corcoran to be near the prison. The engagement was widely dismissed as a bizarre publicity stunt, and some speculated that Starr was motivated by a desire to gain possession of Manson's body and the rights to his estate after his death. Manson himself seemed ambivalent, and the marriage license eventually expired without a ceremony taking place, leaving the relationship as one more inexplicable footnote in a life defined by inexplicable darkness. When Charles Manson finally died on November 19, 2017, the legal circus over his remains erupted with a ferocity that seemed almost scripted. 3 different parties stepped forward to claim the corpse: Jason Freeman, a man claiming to be Manson's grandson, Michael Channels, a longtime pen pal who presented a will allegedly signed by Manson in 2002, and Michael Brunner, Manson's biological son with Mary Brunner, who had long since changed his name and distanced himself from his father's legacy. The dispute wound its way through the Kern County court system, the refrigerated body lying unclaimed in a morgue while the battle raged. In the end, after 4 months of legal wrangling, Jason Freeman won the right to claim Manson's remains. He had the body cremated, and the ashes were scattered in a private ceremony at a location that was never publicly disclosed. There was no funeral, no memorial, no public acknowledgement. The man who had dreamed of global cataclysm and messianic glory disappeared into the wind, his physical remains as insignificant as the abandoned child he had once been. The cultural legacy of the Manson murders is a labyrinth of conflicting narratives, a dark mirror in which the worst fears of a generation are endlessly reflected. The publishing industry, the film studios, and the television networks have never been able to look away. Vincent Bugliosi's 1974 book, Helter Skelter, became the best-selling true crime book in history, a masterful, exhaustive account that cemented the official narrative in the public consciousness. The television miniseries that followed, starring Steve Railsback as Manson, was a ratings sensation that introduced the horror to a new audience. In the decades that followed, Manson appeared as a character in countless films, documentaries, and fictionalized retellings, from the gritty, independent productions of the 1970s to the glossy, revisionist spectacles of the 21st century. The 2019 Quentin Tarantino film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, with its alternate history in which the Manson followers are violently dispatched before they can reach Sharon Tate, was a cathartic fantasy that spoke to a deep, enduring need to rewrite the tragedy, to imagine a world in which the beautiful, pregnant actress was allowed to live, to raise her child, to grow old. But for the families of the real victims, there is no alternate history, no catharsis that can wash away the pain. The enduring, perhaps most significant, legacy of the Manson murders is not the lurid fascination with the killers, but the quiet, relentless advocacy of those who lost their loved ones. Sharon Tate's mother, Doris Tate, transformed her unimaginable grief into a crusade for victims' rights that changed the laws of California. She was a constant, dignified presence at parole hearings, a voice for the dead. And her activism helped to establish the framework that allows victims, families to participate in the criminal justice process. After her death, her daughter Deborah Tate continued the work, a fierce and eloquent guardian of her sister's memory. The LaBianca family, the Sebring family, the Folger family, all of them were forced to become warriors in a battle they never chose. And their efforts have ensured that the names of the victims are not forgotten, that they are not merely footnotes in the biography of a monster. The Manson family murders also left a deep and lasting scar on the American counterculture. The Summer of Love, with its flowers and its music and its naive, beautiful hope, had already begun to sour by 1969. But the Manson atrocities accelerated that disillusionment into a terminal collapse. The hippie movement, which had preached peace and love, was now inextricably associated in the public mind with satanic cults, drug-crazed orgies, and senseless slaughter. The words of the Beatles, which had once been the soundtrack of a utopian dream, were now haunted by the specter of a maniac who had twisted them into a justification for genocide. The communal ideal, the dream of a society without hierarchy or violence, had been permanently stained by the reality of what such a society could become when placed in the hands of a charismatic predator. The cultural hangover was profound and long-lasting, and it would be decades before the trappings of the hippie aesthetic could be viewed without the shadow of Manson falling across them. Perhaps the most chilling and the most important lesson of the Manson family murders is the terrifying fragility of the human psyche, the ease with which evil can be disguised as enlightenment. Charles Manson was not a genius. He was not a brilliant military strategist, nor a master of any occult art. He was a broken, abused child who had learned, in the crucible of the American prison system, how to identify the cracks in other people's souls and pour his poison inside. His teachings were a pastiche of stolen ideas, half-understood scripture, and the ravings of a mind unmoored from reality. And yet he was able to convince a group of intelligent, albeit deeply wounded, young people to abandon everything they had ever known and follow him into a desert of the spirit, to kill for him. To die for him, to write his messages in the blood of the innocent. The question that haunts every examination of the case is not how such a man could exist, but how so many could so willingly surrender their will to him. The answer, as unsettling as it may be, is that the capacity for such submission exists in all of us, in the dark. Unexamined corners of the human heart where the need to belong outweighs the dictates of conscience. The decade that had begun with such hope, with a young president challenging a nation to reach for the moon, ended with a small man with a swastika on his forehead, carving a path of terror across Los Angeles. The moon landing, the triumph of human reason and cooperation, and the Manson murders, the triumph of unreason and isolation, are the twin poles of that era. The light and the shadow that define its legacy. And as the last of the participants grows old and dies, as the parole hearings become less frequent and the media attention fades, what remains is the stark, unblinking fact of the dead. The 7 known victims and the unknown others buried in the desert, whose lives were stolen by a delusion that should never have been given breath. The story of the Manson family is not a story that can be neatly concluded, for the questions it raises about guilt, responsibility, and the nature of evil are timeless. It is a wound that the culture will continue to pick at, a cautionary tale that will be retold as long as there are lost souls searching for a leader, and as long as there are leaders willing to exploit that search. The dust has settled on Spawn Ranch, the old western sets have crumbled into the earth, and the canyon roads are quiet again. But the darkness that was summoned there on those hot, desperate nights of 1969 lingers on, a permanent stain on the American imagination. A whisper in the silence that reminds us that the monsters are always closer than we think, and that the line between a prophet and a devil is drawn in the blood of the innocent. The story of the Manson family, as it has been told and retold in the decades since those blood-soaked nights of 1969, has always been framed by the most visible extremes. The brutality of the killers, the innocence of the victims, the dark charisma of the man at the center. But outside the courtroom, beyond the headlines, and in the quiet, unexamined corners of the aftermath, a parallel narrative has been unfolding. A narrative that belongs not to the monsters or the martyrs, but to the children, the infants and toddlers and unborn souls whose lives were irrevocably shaped by the gravitational pull of Charles Manson's madness. They are the forgotten collateral, the silent survivors of a war they never chose, and their stories provide a different kind of window into the long, lingering shadow of the family. When the Spahn Ranch was raided and the Barker Ranch hideout was exposed, the authorities discovered not only the hard-eyed young adults who had pledged their souls to Manson, but also a small, unaccounted-for population of children. The family, in its twisted emulation of a traditional communal society, had produced offspring. The mothers were the girls of the family, some of whom had borne children fathered by Manson himself, others by the men he designated. These children, born in squalor and chaos, nursed on a diet of apocalyptic prophecy and psychedelic neglect, were the most vulnerable members of the Manson experiment. When the law finally shattered the family's hold, the children were swept into the foster care system, into the arms of bewildered grandparents, or, in some cases, into the keeping of acolytes who still clung to Manson's teachings. Their fates are as varied as they are haunting, and none more so than the son born to Mary Brunner, the first, the quiet, the utterly devoted. Mary Brunner had met Manson in 1967, a librarian whose gentle nature was no defense against the predator who saw in her a perfect vessel. She became his lover, his servant, and on April 15, 1968, the mother of his son. The boy was given the name Michael Brunner, though Manson bestowed upon him the grandiose moniker Sunstone Hawk, a name plucked from the same occult-tinged fantasy that fueled his prophecies. For the first year of his life, Michael was raised within the family, passed from woman to woman, a communal child in the most literal and terrifying sense. He was present at Spahn Ranch, a tiny, oblivious witness to the escalating madness. And when his mother was arrested for her role in the Gary Hinman murder, and later for the various crimes associated with the family, the infant was taken into protective custody. Mary Brunner, the woman who had given up everything for Manson, eventually broke with him while in prison, testifying against other family members and earning a release. But she did not or could not reclaim her son. Michael Brunner was adopted and raised by a couple in the Midwest, his true parentage kept a secret from him for the entirety of his childhood. The revelation, when it finally came, arrived like a bomb detonating in the center of a carefully constructed life. Michael was a teenager, a bright, athletic, all-American boy, when the man he believed to be his father sat him down and explained, with as much gentleness as such a revelation allows, that his biological father was the most infamous murderer in the United States. The shock was, by all accounts, cataclysmic. He had been raised in a loving, stable home, far from the California deserts and the bloody history that clung to his name. He had never known the hunger, the fear, the mind-warping drugs of the family, and yet, in the eyes of the world, he was Charles Manson's son. He changed his name to Michael Brunner, rejecting any connection to the Manson legacy, and he retreated into a fiercely private existence. He refused interviews, he dodged the true crime authors who pursued him, and he built a life that was deliberately, defiantly ordinary. He worked, he married, he had children of his own, and he never, ever spoke publicly about the man whose blood ran in his veins. The only time Michael Brunner emerged from his self-imposed anonymity was in the chaotic aftermath of Manson's death, when the legal battle over the body erupted into a public spectacle. He filed a claim for his father's remains, a move that bewildered many observers. Was it a final act of filial duty, a desire to ensure a decent burial, or a strategic move to prevent the corpse from falling into the hands of the ghoulish fans who were already circling? The motivations remained opaque, and Brunner eventually lost the court fight to Jason Freeman, the man who claimed to be Manson's grandson. With that, Michael Brunner vanished again from the public record, a ghost of a different kind, living proof that the legacy of Charles Manson could be confronted, survived, and to some degree transcended. But not all of Manson's children were so fortunate. Charles Manson had at least two other biological offspring. One, a son born to a woman named Rosalie Willis during his brief, early marriage, was named Charles Manson Jr. The boy grew up in the shadow of a father he barely knew, a father who was a spectral, malevolent presence in the tabloids and on the nightly news. Charles Jr. Eventually changed his name to Jay White, seeking to escape the stigma, but the weight of the name proved too heavy to bear. He struggled with addiction and depression, a man haunted by a connection he had never sought and could never sever. In 1993, at the age of 37, Jay White put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. His suicide note reportedly made no mention of his infamous father, but the trajectory of his life spoke a silent, devastating truth about the poison that can be passed down through blood and memory. The women of the family, too, gave birth to children whose lives began in the crucible of the cult. Sandra Good, the red-haired, fiercely intelligent acolyte who had been a constant companion to Lynette Fromm and a devoted proselytizer for Manson's ATWA philosophy, gave birth to a son in 1970. While awaiting trial on charges related to her post-conviction activities, she named him Ivan, and she raised him for a time in the bizarre, isolated world of the Manson loyalists who still gathered on the fringes of the prison system. When Good was eventually sentenced to prison for her role in a conspiracy to mail threatening letters to corporate executives, the boy was cared for by other members of the dwindling family network. The fate of Ivan Good remains largely unknown, a closed book in a library of closed books. Linda Kasabian, the getaway driver whose testimony had been the linchpin of the prosecution's case, was herself a mother. Her infant daughter Tanya had been with her at Spawn Ranch, a baby wrapped in blankets and sheltered in the back of the decrepit school bus while the monsters plotted their atrocities. Kasabian's decision to flee the family and testify was motivated, in no small part, by her desperate love for her child. A desire to save Tanya from a life that could only end in death or imprisonment. After the trial, Kasabian and her daughter disappeared into the witness protection program. Their identities changed, their past a secret they carried in silence. Kasabian lived a quiet, deeply private life in a series of small towns, working as a waitress, a cook, a woman of no particular note. She died in January 2023 at the age of 73, having never fully escaped the shadow of her own testimony, but having succeeded in the one thing that mattered most to her. She had given her daughter a life free from the family's grip. The children who survived the Manson family are now adults, many of them middle-aged or older, and their silence is a testament to the burden they carry. They are the living embodiment of the question that the true crime genre, in its relentless search for narrative closure, so often overlooks: what happens to the innocents after the cameras leave? After the verdicts are read, after the killers are locked in their concrete tombs. The answer, written in the lives of these scattered, hidden individuals, is that there is no closure, only a long, slow process of healing that is never truly complete. As the children of the family struggled to build lives in the shadow of the abyss, the legal system continued to grind its slow, millennial wheels over the fate of the killers themselves. The parole hearings that punctuated the decades became ritualized dramas, public exorcisms in which the survivors of the dead confronted the aging, gray-haired figures who had stolen their loved ones. Patricia Krenwinkel, the tall, gawky girl who had stabbed Rosemary LaBianca, with a frenzy so intense that she later described it as a kind of ecstatic release, became a central figure in these proceedings. Krenwinkel had been, by the assessment of many prison psychologists, one of the most thoroughly rehabilitated inmates in the California system. She had been a model prisoner for over 5 decades, earning degrees, working in programs for blind inmates, and expressing a remorse that her advocates argued was deep and genuine. And yet the parole board, year after year, looked at the photographs of the LaBianca crime scene, listened to the anguished testimony of the surviving relatives, and concluded that some crimes are so profound, so fundamentally destructive of the social contract, that even a lifetime of good behavior cannot atone for them. Krenwinkel remains incarcerated, the longest-serving woman in the California penal system, a 70-something-year-old grandmother whose only remaining freedom is the freedom of her memory to replay endlessly the screams of a woman who died half a century ago. The same ritual played out again and again for Charles Tex Watson. The handsome, all-American boy from Cokeville, Texas, had become a soft-spoken, gray-haired minister. A man who recorded sermons about the redemptive power of Jesus Christ and fathered 4 children during conjugal visits that the state, in a different era, had permitted. Watson's prison ministry, Abounding Love, continued to operate, its website a glossy, professional portal to a world in which a mass murderer had been reborn as a man of God. The families of the victims viewed this ministry as an obscenity, a calculated manipulation designed to obscure the reality of what Watson had done. And what he had done, according to his own detailed confession, was shoot Stephen Parent 4 times, stab Jay Sebring as he lay dying, and plunge a bayonet into Sharon Tate's pregnant body while she screamed for her mother. The parole board, weighing the polished remorse of the minister against the ghost of the monster, consistently denied his release. Watson remains in prison, his fate sealed not by a lack of rehabilitation, but by the sheer, unscalable wall of the atrocity he committed. Bobby Beausoleil, the dark-eyed musician who had plunged the knife into Gary Hinman while the Beatles played on the stereo, also sought redemption through art. From his cell, Beausoleil became a prolific painter and musician, creating works of a swirling, psychedelic intensity that found a market among collectors of what is known, with a queasy euphemism, as murderabilia. He recorded albums of synthesizer music, scored experimental films, and conducted relationships with a series of women on the outside who were drawn to his brooding artistic persona. His parole hearings became a strange collision of aesthetics and atrocity, with Beausoleil presenting himself as a transformed man whose creative output was proof of his rehabilitation, while the family of Gary Hinman presented a different portrait, that of a man who had tortured a gentle music teacher for 3 days before carving political piggy into the wall in his blood. The board, like a stone wall that refuses to erode, denied Beausoleil every single time. He remains behind bars, his hair now white, his art a permanent exhibit in the gallery of the damned. The story of the Manson family has always been, at its core, a story of manipulation, of the dark alchemy that can turn a lost, searching soul into a weapon. The psychological mechanisms that Manson employed have been dissected by generations of forensic psychologists, criminologists, and cult experts, each seeking to understand how a man of such limited intellect and such grandiose delusion could command such absolute loyalty. The process Manson used was, in its way, a masterpiece of brutalist social engineering, a step-by-step dismantling of the individual self. The first stage was the systematic isolation of the recruit from any external support structure. Manson would identify a vulnerable target, a runaway, a rebel, a soul shattered by family trauma, and envelop them in a cocoon of intense, exclusive attention. He would tell them that their parents were their enemies, that society was a prison, that the only true family was the one he offered. He would separate them from their money, their identification papers, their past identities, until the only mirror in which they could see themselves was the mirror of Manson's eyes. Once the recruit was isolated, Manson would deploy the second weapon, the deliberate, strategic use of psychedelic drugs, particularly LSD. He would dose his followers constantly, often without their full knowledge, and then guide their trips with a mixture of soothing words and terrifying pronouncements. He would tell them that the hallucinations they were experiencing were not random firings of a drugged brain, but profound, cosmic revelations. He would whisper that he alone understood the true nature of the universe, and that they, if they surrendered completely to his will, could share in that understanding. The LSD, combined with the sleep deprivation and the constant group pressure, eroded the boundaries of the self until the follower could no longer distinguish between Manson's thoughts and their own. This was the state of ego dissolution that Manson described, with characteristic grandiosity, as dying to yourself, and it was the psychological precondition for the violence that was to come. The third stage was the construction of a new, synthetic identity that was entirely dependent on Manson's approval. He would give his followers new names, often stripping them of their given names as a symbolic act of rebirth. Susan Atkins became Sadie Mee Glutz, Patricia Krenwinkel became Katie. Leslie Van Houten became Lulu. These names were not mere nicknames, they were the markers of a new creation, a Manson-constructed self that had no history, no family, no moral framework except the one that Manson provided. The new names were accompanied by a new set of rules, a bizarre, contradictory code that combined the language of free love with the reality of absolute control. Manson dictated every aspect of their lives, when they ate, who they slept with, what they thought. He would stage elaborate orgies, not as expressions of liberation, but as rituals of domination, in which he would assign sexual partners to his followers like a feudal lord distributing favors. The women, in particular, were conditioned to view their bodies as instruments of Manson's will, tools to be used for his pleasure, his recruitment, and his strategic manipulation of outsiders. The final stage, the stage that transformed a cult into a death squad, was the implantation of the helter-skelter prophecy. Manson took the fears and the tensions of late 1960s America, the race riots, the assassinations, the generational warfare, and wove them into a cosmic narrative in which the family were the chosen survivors. He told his followers that the black man was about to rise up and slaughter the white establishment, and that this slaughter was not only inevitable but righteous. He convinced them that the Beatles, the gods of the counterculture, were speaking directly to him, transmitting coded instructions through songs like Helter Skelter, Blackbird, and Revolution 9. The followers, their minds already shattered and remade by the earlier stages of conditioning, absorbed this prophecy as literal, imminent truth. They believed that the murders they were about to commit were not murders at all, but the necessary sparks that would ignite the purifying fire. In their minds, they were not killers, they were soldiers in a holy war, and the people they were about to slaughter were not individuals with names and histories and beating hearts, but symbols. Pigs, obstacles to the coming paradise. The psychological landscape that Manson created was, in essence, a total institution more effective than any prison because its walls were internal. His followers were not held by chains, they were held by the terror of meaninglessness, by the desperate. All too human need to believe that their suffering had a purpose and that their lives mattered to someone, even if that someone was a monster. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of the Manson phenomenon. The techniques he used were not exotic or supernatural. They were the same techniques of isolation, indoctrination, and identity destruction that have been used by cult leaders, abusive partners, and authoritarian regimes throughout history. Manson's dark genius was not his originality. It was his feral, instinctive ability to deploy these techniques on the vulnerable, the wandering, the young. Yet, for all the certainty of the official narrative, a persistent and unsettling counter-narrative has lingered in the margins of the case, whispered in true crime forums and debated in revisionist documentaries. This counter-narrative does not dispute that Manson's followers committed the murders. The forensic evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible. What it questions is the motive, the grand, apocalyptic helter-skelter that Vincent Bugliosi so masterfully constructed for the jury. The alternate theory, advanced by a variety of investigators, journalists, and even some retired law enforcement officials, suggests that the Tate LaBianca murders were not, in their original intent, the opening salvos of a race war, but were rather a series of escalating crimes driven by more mundane, if no less horrific, motivations: revenge, cover-up, and the desperate attempt to free a fellow family member from jail. The linchpin of this alternative explanation is the murder of Gary Hinman, which occurred on July 27, 1969, just 2 weeks before the Silo Drive massacre. According to this theory, Bobby Bosolil's arrest for Hinman's murder on August 6, 1969, sent Manson into a panic. The police had Bosolil, they had the bloody knife, they had the word political piggy scrawled on the wall, and they had a clear motive: a drug ripoff gone wrong. Manson, the theory goes, feared that Bosolil would crack under interrogation and reveal the full scope of the family's criminal enterprise. The solution, in Manson's cunning, deranged mind, was to commit a series of copycat murders, killings that would mimic the Hinman scene so closely, with the same bloody writing and the same apparent political overtones, that the police would be forced to conclude that the real killers were still at large, and that Bosolil must therefore be innocent. The proponents of this theory point to the similarities between the crime scenes: the use of the victim's blood to write political slogans, the method of binding the victims with rope, the sheer overkill of the stabbings. They argue that the word pig, written on Sharon Tate's door, was not a reference to the Black Panthers or the coming race war, but a deliberate echo of the political piggy that Bosolil had painted on Hinman's wall. In this reading, the helter-skelter motive was a brilliant prosecutorial construct. a narrative that Bugliosi seized upon because it was so terrifying, so bizarre, and so perfectly tailored to explain the inexplicable, but it was not the actual, operational motive of the killers on those August nights. The actual motive, according to this darker and more prosaic theory, was simply the cold, pragmatic calculation of a criminal mastermind trying to spring his lieutenant from jail. Another strand of the counter-narrative focuses on the drug world that intersected with the Manson family in the canyons of Los Angeles. Wojtek Frykowski, the Polish screenwriter who died so brutally on the lawn of Silo Drive, was, by many accounts, a small-time drug dealer who had connections to the darker edges of the Hollywood scene. Some investigators have speculated that the murders were the result of a drug burn, a transaction gone catastrophically wrong, and that Manson and his followers were dispatched to the house not to ignite a race war, but to collect a debt or to send a message to the drug underworld. The sheer, visceral brutality of the killings in this interpretation was intended to intimidate, to demonstrate what happened to those who crossed the family's business interests. The helter-skelter ideology in this view was a delusion that Manson held, but it was not the proximate cause of the murders. It was the wallpaper that decorated the room in which the real, grubby crime took place. The official narrative, as presented by Bugliosi, remains the legally accepted version of events, and it is the version that the majority of the public believes. But the persistence of these alternative theories speaks to a deeper truth about the Manson case. It is a crime so profound, so senseless, that it resists easy explanation. The helter-skelter motive, with its Beatles lyrics and its apocalyptic visions, is so bizarre that it is, paradoxically, easier to accept than the idea that such horror could be motivated by something as banal as a cover-up or a drug deal. The mind recoils from the notion that 7 people could be butchered for the sake of a legal maneuver or a financial dispute. It is more psychologically comfortable, in a strange way, to believe that the killers were driven by a grandiose, insane ideology, because such a motive places them in a category of evil that feels distant, alien, and safely removed from the everyday world. The cultural fascination with the Manson family has never dimmed, and the proliferation of alternative theories has only added fuel to the fire. The year 2019 marked the 50th anniversary of the murders, and the anniversary unleashed a torrent of media, from major studio films to multi-part documentary series, each seeking to find a new angle on a story that has been told so many times it has acquired the texture of a modern myth. Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was the most prominent of these commemorations, a sprawling, sun-drenched fairy tale that imagined a different ending, in which the Manson followers who came to Silo Drive were met not by a pregnant actress and her friends, but by a washed-up stuntman and his pit bull, and were dispatched with a righteous, explosive violence that left audiences cheering. The film was a cathartic fantasy, a wish fulfillment that acknowledged the cultural trauma by rewriting it. And its massive success demonstrated the enduring hold that the Manson story has on the collective imagination. But the anniversary also brought a fresh wave of grief for the families of the victims, who were forced once again to watch their loved ones' final moments be dissected, dramatized, and commodified. Deborah Tate, Sharon's sister, who had dedicated her life to the victims' rights movement, spoke out with a mixture of resignation and frustration. She understood the public's fascination, but she pleaded for the culture to remember that the story was not a piece of entertainment. It was a tragedy that had shattered real families, real lives, real futures. She asked that the names of the victims be spoken, that the focus be on their lives and not on the monster who had ended them. It was a plea that was honored by some and ignored by others in the endless churn of the true crime industry. As the 55th anniversary of the murders approaches, the physical sites of the crimes have become a strange, uncomfortable form of pilgrimage destination. The house at 10,050 Silo Drive, the epicenter of the horror, was demolished in 1994. Its address changed to 10,066 Silo Drive in an attempt to exorcise the ghosts. A massive Mediterranean-style mansion now sits on the site, its owners fiercely protective of their privacy, yet the driveway where Stephen Parent was gunned down is still, in a sense, public property, a place where the curious and the morbid still find their way, snapping photographs, leaving flowers, or simply standing in the silence, trying to feel the presence of the past. The La Bianca house at 3301 Waverly Drive still stands, its owners having resisted the impulse to erase the history. A fact that has made it a source of ongoing tension with the neighbors who wish to live in peace. The Spawn Movie Ranch, the epicenter of the family's communal madness, burned to the ground in a wildfire in 1970, the old western sets reduced to ash. As if nature itself had decided to cleanse the stain. The Barker Ranch, the final hideout in the desolate vastness of Death Valley, still stands, its crumbling walls a mecca for the most dedicated of Manson obsessives, who braved the brutal desert heat to touch the stones where the family once huddled, waiting for the apocalypse that never came. The Manson case has become, in the annals of American crime, a mirror that reflects the darkest recesses of the culture back at itself. Every generation discovers the story anew, and every generation finds in it a warning that feels urgently, terrifyingly relevant. In an era of online radicalization, of young people seduced by charismatic, hateful voices in the digital wilderness, the story of how a failed musician with a guitar and a grudge could build a death cult in the hills of Los Angeles feels less like history and more like prophecy. The techniques that Manson pioneered, the isolation, the love bombing, the weaving of conspiratorial, apocalyptic narratives, are the same techniques that, in the age of the internet, have been scaled to global proportions. The questions that the Manson family forces us to confront are not nostalgic questions about the end of the 60s. They are urgent, present-tense questions about the nature of belief, the fragility of the self, and the ease with which the disaffected can be transformed into the destructive. The summer of 1969 has receded into the distant past, a sepia-toned memory of miniskirts and muscle cars and music that changed the world. The last of the Manson killers are old and dying. The parole hearings are becoming less frequent, the headlines smaller, the public attention more fleeting. And yet the darkness that was unleashed on those hot, violent nights has never fully dissipated. It has soaked into the soil of the culture, a contaminant that no amount of time can fully purify. The name Charles Manson is still a synonym for pure, unadulterated evil, and the faces of the young women who killed for him, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, are still the faces that haunt the nightmares of a nation that once believed it was on the verge of a new age of peace and love. The story of the Manson family is not a closed case. It is an open wound, and the blood that was spilled in the canyons and the suburbs in 1969 continues to drip slowly, silently, into the present. A reminder that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we dare to believe, and that the monsters are not out there in the dark. They are, and always have been, within us. The desert has a way of keeping secrets. The vast sun-scorched expanses of the Mojave, the Panamint Range, and the desolate badlands that stretch between Los Angeles and the Nevada border are a repository of lost things, abandoned mines. Ghost towns, the rusted hulks of cars that gave out decades ago, and the bones of those who wandered too far from the road and never found their way back. The Manson family knew these deserts intimately. They fled there when the heat of the law became too intense, disappearing into the canyons of Death Valley, seeking refuge in the remote, crumbling cabins that dotted the alkaline flats. And if the persistent whispers are to be believed, they buried their dead there too. For decades after the convictions, the rumor persisted that the official body count, the 7 souls taken at Silo Drive and Waverly Drive, the mutilated body of Gary Hinman, the dismembered remains of Shorty Shee, was merely the visible portion of a far greater slaughter. The family had been nomadic, predatory, and utterly without conscience. They had picked up hitchhikers, they had clashed with drug dealers, they had absorbed and then discarded a constantly shifting cast of runaways and hangers-on. Some of those people simply vanished, their names never entered into any missing persons database because they had already severed every connection to their former lives. The desert, vast and indifferent, swallowed their stories whole. The most determined effort to unearth these secrets came in the spring of 2008, when a joint task force of investigators, forensic anthropologists, and cadaver dogs converged on the Barker Ranch, the family's final hideout. The ranch, a dilapidated collection of stone and wood buildings at the end of a bone-rattling dirt road, had been Manson's last redoubt before his capture in October 1969. It was here that he had planned to wait out helter-skelter, leading his followers into a subterranean paradise he called the bottomless pit. A literal hole in the desert floor where the chosen would survive the coming apocalypse. The pit turned out to be a natural cavern, dusty and inhospitable, but the symbolism was powerful enough for the family to treat the location as sacred ground. The 2008 search, prompted by decades of tips and the persistent advocacy of investigators who believed that more victims lay beneath the rocks and creosote bushes, was the most extensive forensic excavation of the site ever undertaken. The cadaver dogs were the first to signal. They are trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, a smell that can seep upward through decades of dry soil and rock, and they indicated with a chilling certainty that something or someone was buried in at least 2 locations on the property. The investigators, their hopes and dread mingling in the 110-degree heat, began to dig. The cameras of the national media, which had descended upon the remote site in a caravan of satellite trucks, captured every shovelful of dirt. The world watched, breath held, as the desert prepared to surrender its ghosts. Sifting through the soil, the forensic team discovered fragments that quickened the pulse. A piece of fabric, a button, a length of what appeared to be old rope. And then the unmistakable, ghostly white gleam of bone. But the bones, when they were examined, told a story of anticlimax. They were not human. The fragments belonged to animals, coyotes, rabbits, the detritus of a desert ecosystem. The fabric was a scrap of denim, indistinguishable from 1,000 other pieces of trash that blow across the Mojave. The cadaver dogs, for all their extraordinary training, could sometimes be fooled by the scent of other decaying mammals, particularly in an environment as chemically complex as a ranch that had been inhabited by a transient, unhygienic population for months. After days of painstaking excavation, the team packed up their equipment, and the Barker Ranch returned to its silence. The mystery of the potential additional victims remained unsolved, a cold case that the desert refused to open. But the absence of physical evidence has never been enough to extinguish the testimonies of those who lived through the nightmare. The surviving members of the family, the ones who escaped before the bloodletting began, carry memories that no forensic dig can unearth. Their stories provide a different kind of evidence, a mosaic of terror and survival that reveals the full, suffocating reality of life inside the cult. And among these survivors, the voice of Diane Lake is one of the most haunting, because she was so young, so vulnerable, and so thoroughly consumed by the monster that she barely survived with her sanity intact. Diane Lake was 14 years old when her parents, swept up in the utopian dreams of the counterculture, dropped her off at Spawn Ranch in the spring of 1968. Her parents were not monsters. They were products of their time, seekers who had bounced from commune to commune, convinced that a new age of enlightenment was dawning. They had met Charles Manson through a web of hippie acquaintances, and they had been charmed, as so many were, by his magnetic, soft-spoken intensity. They believed that the family was a safe, nurturing environment for their daughter, a place where she could escape the rigid conformity of mainstream society and grow up free. They left her there, a child with long, dark hair and a trusting heart, and they drove away, not realizing that they had delivered her into the hands of a predator. Diane became one of Manson's favorites. She was young, obedient, and utterly moldable, a blank slate upon which he could inscribe his darkest fantasies. He gave her LSD, often without her knowledge, and guided her through the terrifying, mind-shattering trips that followed. He told her that she was special, that she had been chosen for a great purpose, and he isolated her from any influence that might have pulled her back to reality. For nearly 2 years, Diane Lake lived in a fog of drugs, sexual exploitation, and psychological manipulation, her childhood stolen one day at a time. She was present for the escalating paranoia, the stockpiling of weapons, the apocalyptic rants about helter-skelter. She was not chosen to participate in the murders. She was deemed too young, too fragile, but she saw the killers leave and return, and she absorbed the unspoken horror of what had happened. When the family scattered after the raids, Diane was taken to Barker Ranch, the final, desperate hideout. It was there, as the police closed in, that her mind finally began to fracture. She was found by the arresting officers not as a defiant cultist, but as a broken, nearly catatonic child. She was so disconnected from reality that she could barely speak her own name. The authorities did not know what to do with her. She was technically a juvenile, but she was also a material witness, a potential source of information about the murders. She was placed in a psychiatric facility, where she spent months slowly clawing her way back to sanity. The therapists worked to deprogram her, to peel away the layers of Manson's indoctrination, and to help her reconstruct a self that had been shattered almost beyond repair. Diane Lake's testimony, when she was finally able to give it, was crucial to the prosecution. She could speak to the atmosphere of the family, the preparations for violence, the way that Manson had warped the minds of his followers. But her recovery did not end with the trial. It took her decades to fully process what had been done to her, to forgive the parents who had abandoned her to a monster, and to build a life that was not defined by the 2 years she had spent in the abyss. She eventually married, had children, and became a school teacher, spending her days in the company of children the same age she had been when her innocence was stolen. In 2017, she published a memoir, Member of the Family, a raw, unflinching account of her experiences that gave voice to the silent suffering of the cult's youngest victims. Her story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it is also a chilling reminder of how close Manson came to destroying her entirely. Another voice that broke the silence was that of Barbara Hoyt, a young woman whose escape from the family was so audacious, so desperate, that it reads like a scene from a thriller. Hoyt was a 17-year-old from a middle-class family when she fell in with Manson in the summer of 1969. She was bright, curious, and deeply unhappy in her conventional life, and Manson's promises of freedom and transcendence were like a drug. She moved to Spahn Ranch and was swiftly absorbed into the family's routines, the drugs, the sex, the endless, rambling sermons. She was present during the turbulent weeks surrounding the murders, and although she did not participate directly, she saw and heard enough to understand on some level what had happened. Her instinct for self-preservation, still flickering beneath the layers of indoctrination, began to scream at her to run. The opportunity came after the family had relocated to Barker Ranch. Hoyt, along with another young woman, managed to slip away from the group and hike for miles across the brutal desert terrain, flagging down a ride on a remote highway. They made their way back to civilization and, eventually, to the authorities. Hoyt agreed to cooperate with the prosecution, and her testimony was scheduled to be a critical component of the case. But the family, even from behind bars, had a long reach. Manson's followers on the outside, the loyal acolytes who still gathered and plotted, identified Hoyt as a traitor, and they devised a plan to silence her. One of them approached her and, under the guise of friendship, offered her a hamburger. The hamburger was laced with a massive dose of LSD. The intent was not to kill her, but to send her so far into a psychotic trip that she would be discredited as a witness, her mind so shattered that no jury would believe anything she said. Barbara Hoyt ate the hamburger. The trip that followed was a voyage into a landscape of absolute terror. She hallucinated that her skin was melting, that demons were crawling out of the walls, that the very fabric of reality was unraveling. She was found wandering the streets, screaming, utterly unmoored. She was hospitalized, and for a time it seemed that the family's plan had succeeded. But Barbara Hoyt, like Diane Lake, proved to be made of stronger stuff. She clawed her way back from the edge, and when she was finally able to take the stand, she did so with a quiet, unshakable courage that pierced the courtroom. She identified the women who had poisoned her, and her testimony helped to convict not only Manson and the killers, but also the secondary network of followers who had conspired to obstruct justice. She then vanished into a new identity, a new life. Her name changed, her past a secret she shared with almost no one. The stories of Diane Lake and Barbara Hoyt are the counter-narrative to the mythology of the Manson girls as unrepentant monsters. They are proof that the brainwashing, however profound, was not always permanent, that the human conscience could, with immense effort, be reclaimed from the abyss. But for every Diane Lake who escaped, there were others who did not, whose fates remain unknown. The desert still holds its secrets, and the question of how many more bodies might be out there, buried in unmarked graves or scattered in the canyons, continues to haunt the investigators who have dedicated their lives to the case. The official investigation into the Manson family murders was, in many ways, the catalyst for a revolution in American law enforcement's approach to cults, serial killers, and the psychology of mass violence. Before 1969, the concept of a nomadic, drug-fueled death cult operating in the margins of American society was the stuff of pulp fiction, not a reality that the police had any framework for understanding. The Manson case forced the criminal justice system to develop new tools, new vocabularies, and new ways of thinking about the nature of evil. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the legendary team that would later profile serial killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, cut its teeth on the Manson case, analyzing the crime scenes, the psychology of the followers, and the manipulative techniques of the leader. The case became a foundational text for the study of cult dynamics, influencing everything from hostage negotiation strategies to the deprogramming techniques that would later be used to extract members from groups like the People's Temple and the Branch Davidians. The forensic evidence from the Manson crime scenes also spurred advancements in the science of criminal investigation. The sheer volume of blood, the complex bindings, the written messages, all of it demanded a meticulous, interdisciplinary approach that was relatively new at the time. The LAPD's handling of the case, initially fragmented and error-prone, became a cautionary tale that led to significant reforms in how multi-agency investigations were coordinated. The miscommunication between the sheriff's department and the city police, which had delayed the connection between the Tate and LaBianca murders, was a systemic failure that the law enforcement community vowed never to repeat. The case became a staple in police academies, a grim textbook on the importance of interdepartmental cooperation and the critical value of forensic detail. Yet for all the lessons learned, the Manson case also exposed a deep, uncomfortable truth about American culture. The public's fascination with the killers often overshadowed the memory of the victims. The phenomenon of Manson fandom, which began even before the trial was over, grew into a bizarre and persistent subculture. Women wrote love letters to Manson, proposing marriage and pledging their devotion. Websites dedicated to his writings and his music proliferated in the early days of the internet. His face, with its carved swastika and its wild, staring eyes, appeared on t-shirts sold in mall stores and on posters tacked to dorm room walls. This macabre celebrity was a source of unending pain for the families of the victims, who watched as the man who had slaughtered their loved ones became a cultural icon, a symbol of rebellion, a sort of dark saint. The copycat phenomenon was, in some ways, even more disturbing. The Manson murders inspired a number of individuals and fringe groups who saw the killings as a template for revolutionary violence. The concept of helter-skelter, a race war sparked by brutal, symbolic murders, influenced the ideology of various extremist factions in the 1970s and beyond. In 1973, a group of young people in Texas, calling themselves the Manson Family II, engaged in a series of crimes that echoed the original murders. In the 1980s, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, cited Manson as an inspiration, his own rampage of murder and sexual assault carrying the same overtones of satanic ritual and chaos. The specter of the family hung over the satanic panic of the 1980s and early 1990s, a moral crusade that saw devil-worshipping cults lurking in every daycare center and heavy metal album. A cultural hysteria that the Manson murders had, in a very real sense, helped to create. The battle over Manson's music, his one true obsession, became a surreal subplot in the decades following his imprisonment. Manson had recorded a substantial body of songs, primitive folk tunes, and rambling spoken-word pieces that he believed were the key to his fame. While in prison, he continued to write and record, and the question of who owned these recordings, and whether they could be commercially exploited, became the subject of endless legal wrangling. In 1993, the band Guns N' Roses, already infamous for their own brand of Dionysian chaos, included a Manson-penned song, "Look at Your Game." Girl, as a hidden track on their album, The Spaghetti Incident, the decision provoked a firestorm of outrage. Sharon Tate's mother, Doris, condemned the band, and the public debate over the ethics of profiting from a murderer's art reached a fever pitch. The band eventually agreed to donate the royalties to the son of one of the victims, but the gesture did little to quell the sense that a line had been crossed, that the dead were being disrespected in the name of rock and roll rebellion. The true, enduring legacy of the victims was not in the music of their killer, but in the movement that their families built from the ashes of their grief. Doris Tate, Sharon's mother, transformed her unimaginable loss into a mission that would change the legal landscape of California. In the years following the trial, Doris became a constant, dignified presence at parole hearings, a voice for the voiceless, a representative of the dead. She was not content to simply mourn. She wanted to ensure that other families would not have to endure the same agony of watching their loved ones' killers seek freedom. She became a driving force behind the passage of the Victims' Bill of Rights in California, a landmark piece of legislation that gave victims and their families the right to testify at parole hearings, to be notified of developments in their cases, and to have a formal role in the criminal justice process. The law, which was passed in 1982, was a direct response to the spectacle of the Manson parole hearings, where the killers seemed to have more rights than the families they had shattered. Doris Tate's work was continued after her death by her daughter Deborah, who became a fierce and eloquent advocate for victims' rights on a national scale. Deborah Tate spoke before Congress, she advised presidents, and she stood, year after year, in the sterile hearing rooms of the California prison system, facing the aging. Gray-haired women who had participated in her sister's murder, and she told them, and the world, that the crime they had committed was beyond forgiveness. Her advocacy helped to ensure that the Manson followers, despite their decades of good behavior and their claims of rehabilitation, would remain behind bars for the maximum possible duration of their sentences. The parole hearings became a kind of ritual, a public accounting in which the culture reaffirmed its commitment to the memory of the victims, a ceremony of remembrance that no amount of time could erode. As the years have turned into decades, the physical traces of the Manson family have been slowly erased from the landscape. The Spawn movie ranch, the locus of so much madness, was consumed by a wildfire in September 1970, just over a year after the murders. The flames roared through the dry hills of Chatsworth, devouring the old western sets, the stables, the ramshackle buildings where the family had plotted their apocalypse. The fire was an act of nature, but it felt to many like a purgation, a cleansing of the ground that had been soaked in so much evil. The site is now part of a state park, its history unmarked by any plaque, known only to the hikers and the true crime pilgrims who navigate by GPS coordinates and whispered legend. The Barker Ranch, deep in the unforgiving vastness of Death Valley, is still reachable, but only by those who are willing to endure the punishing journey. The buildings have been ransacked by souvenir hunters and weather-beaten by decades of desert storms. The walls are covered in graffiti, some of it tributes to Manson, some of it condemnations. The National Park Service, which now administers the land, has considered demolishing the structures entirely, but the logistical challenges and the historical significance, however dark, have stayed the wrecking ball. The ranch remains a ghostly monument to the last, desperate days of the family, a place where the silence is broken only by the wind and the occasional, eerie cry of a coyote. The house at 3301 Waverly Drive, where Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were butchered, is the one murder site that remains a private residence. The house has been sold multiple times, and each new owner has had to reckon with the terrible history that clings to the address. The current owners, aware of the macabre interest that their home attracts, have installed security cameras and high fences, but they cannot prevent the curious from driving slowly past, their eyes searching for a glimpse of the front door, the driveway, the window where the lights burned on that hot August night. The neighbors, weary of the attention, have learned to live with the occasional sound of a car idling in the street, the click of a camera. The house is beautiful, a Spanish-style villa with a red tile roof, and it holds its secrets behind its stucco walls, a silent, unwilling participant in the ongoing drama of the Manson legacy. The investigation into the Manson family has never truly been closed. Even now, detectives receive tips, letters, and phone calls from people who claim to have information about additional murders, additional victims, additional horrors that were never uncovered. Most of these leads are the products of delusion, the ravings of those who want to insert themselves into the story, but occasionally a detail emerges that gives even the most jaded investigator pause. The desert remains the obvious place to look. The vast, empty stretches of California and Nevada, the abandoned mine shafts and the dry washes, could easily conceal a body or several. The logistics of mounting another large-scale excavation are daunting. and the political will to spend millions of dollars on a 50-year-old cold case is scarce. And so the secrets remain, buried under the sand and the rock, waiting for a future that may never come. The psychological profile of Charles Manson, painstakingly assembled by the experts who studied him, reveals a man who was, in the clinical sense, a profoundly damaged human being. He scored a perfect 40 on the Hare psychopathy checklist, a diagnostic tool that measures the traits of a psychopath. He was glib, grandiose, manipulative, utterly devoid of empathy, and completely incapable of remorse. He had a parasitic lifestyle, a history of juvenile delinquency, and a long record of criminal versatility. But the clinical profile, however accurate, can never fully capture the essence of what made Manson so dangerous. His power lay not in his intellect, which was sharp but undisciplined, nor in his physical presence, which was unimpressive. His power lay in his feral, instinctive understanding of human need. He knew how to find the wound in a person's soul and press on it until the person submitted. He offered the one thing that every human being craves: a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a family. And then he used that gift to destroy everything that was good and decent in those who accepted it. The parallel between Manson's methods and the techniques of modern online radicalization is impossible to ignore. The isolation, the love bombing, the construction of a grandiose, apocalyptic narrative that justifies violence. These are the same tools that are now deployed in the digital wilderness by extremist groups of every ideological stripe. The young men and women who are seduced into acts of terror by online propaganda are the spiritual descendants of the Manson girls. Their minds colonized by a narrative that transforms murder into martyrdom and cruelty into virtue. The Manson case is not a relic of the 1960s. It is a blueprint for the psychology of extremism. A warning that the vulnerability to charismatic evil is not a historical anomaly, but a permanent feature of the human condition. As the final participants in the Manson drama grow old and die, the case is passing from the realm of living memory into the realm of history. The children of the victims, now older than their parents ever got to be, carry the burden of the past into a new century. The grandchildren who never knew the dead but who have grown up with their photographs, their stories, and the empty spaces at family gatherings are the new keepers of the flame. The legacy of the Manson family is not a single, coherent narrative but a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting a different angle of tragedy: the loss of innocence, the failure of institutions, the resilience of survivors, and the dark, abiding mystery of how such a thing could ever have happened at all. The sun continues to rise over the canyons of Los Angeles, just as it did on that August morning in 1969. The hills are still dry and golden, the palm trees still sway in the hot, indifferent wind, and the city still sprawls beneath the smoggy sky, a place of dreams and nightmares colliding. The story of the Manson family is written into the landscape, into the legal code, into the cultural DNA of a nation that was forced, on those terrible nights, to confront the monsters that had been growing in its own garden. The desert still holds its secrets, the prison cells still hold the aging bodies of the killers, and the world still asks, with a mixture of horror and fascination, the only question that matters: how did it happen? The answer is not simple and it is not comfortable, but it is there, waiting in the testimony of the survivors, in the blood-stained evidence files, and in the silence of the desert that keeps its watch over the dead. The morning of July 11, 2023, dawned gray and heavy over the sprawling, sun-bleached expanse of the California Institution for Women in Corona. The prison, a low-slung complex of concrete and razor wire, had been the home of some of the most notorious female criminals in American history, but on this day, the world's attention was fixed on a single, aging woman who was about to walk through its gates and into a freedom that half a century of legal battles had failed to secure. The air outside the prison was thick with the static of anticipation. News vans with their satellite dishes raised toward the sky lined the dusty road, their engines idling, their cameras aimed at the barred exit. Reporters stood in clusters, rehearsing their opening lines, their voices a low murmur against the distant hum of the freeway. And scattered among the press, a small, fervent group of protesters held signs, their messages a raw, unhealed wound. Remember the victims, no parole for murderers, and the names of the dead. Written in thick black letters, held aloft like shields against forgetting. Inside the prison, Leslie Van Houten, 73 years old, her hair now white and cut short in a practical, unadorned style, sat in a holding room that she had entered as a girl of 19 and was now leaving as a woman in the final act of her life. She had been a homecoming princess once, a bright-eyed teenager from a broken home who had fallen under the spell of a monster and had participated with a ferocity that still defied comprehension in the brutal murder of Rosemary LaBianca. She had held the woman down while Patricia Krenwinkel stabbed her, had, by her own later admission, plunged a knife into the dying woman's body, and had then calmly helped to scrawl bloody messages on the walls. For 53 years she had been a prisoner, and for most of those years she had been a model one, earning degrees, mentoring other inmates, and articulating in the measured, reflective language of therapy and self-examination, a remorse that her advocates insisted was absolute and genuine. The legal machinery that had kept Leslie Van Houten behind bars for so long was a labyrinth of shifting laws and political calculation. In 1971, she had been sentenced to death, a sentence that was commuted to life when the California Supreme Court briefly abolished capital punishment. For decades, she had appeared before the parole board, her gray hair and soft voice a stark contrast to the images from 1969 that still haunted the public imagination. The board had recommended her release multiple times, convinced that the woman she had become bore no resemblance to the girl who had helped to slaughter a stranger. But the governors of California, first Jerry Brown and then Gavin Newsom, had reversed those recommendations, citing the depravity of the crime and the enduring pain of the victims' families. The political calculus was unforgiving. No governor wanted to be remembered as the one who freed a Manson killer, but the courts had finally intervened. In May 2023, a California appeals court ruled that Newsom had overstepped his authority in denying Van Houten's parole, finding that she had met every statutory requirement for release and that the governor's reversal was not supported by the evidence. The state did not appeal, and the path to the prison gate was cleared. The reaction from the families of the victims was swift and anguished. Deborah Tate, the sister of Sharon Tate, who had dedicated her entire adult life to ensuring that the killers of her sister and the others would never walk free, issued a statement of profound grief and outrage. The LaBianca family, whose patriarch and matriarch had been butchered in their own home, spoke of the unending nightmare that the release reawakened. And yet on that gray July morning, the law had spoken, and Leslie Van Houten was about to become a free woman. At precisely 8 o'clock, a plain white van, its windows darkened, emerged from the sally port of the prison and turned onto the public road. The cameras surged forward, the reporters shouting questions that dissolved into the wind. The van did not stop. It accelerated past the crowd and disappeared down the highway, carrying Van Houten to a transitional housing facility where she would begin the disorienting process of re-entering a world that had transformed beyond recognition since her imprisonment. The protesters held their signs a little higher, their voices cracking with emotion. The news anchors launched into their prepared packages, weaving the footage of the van's departure into the larger tapestry of the Manson saga. And the world, once again, was forced to confront the uncomfortable question that Leslie Van Houten's release embodied. Can a human being who has committed an act of absolute evil ever truly be redeemed? And does the state have the right to deny that redemption, even after a lifetime of apparent transformation? The release of Leslie Van Houten was not the only seismic event in the Manson universe that year. Just 6 months earlier, on January 21, 2023, a death had occurred that, in its own quiet way, closed a chapter of the story that had been essential to the conviction of the killers. Linda Kasabian, the young mother who had driven the getaway car on both nights of murder, and whose testimony had been the linchpin of the prosecution's case, passed away at the age of 73 in a hospital in Tacoma, Washington. Her death was reported in a brief, almost unnoticed obituary, her name listed under the pseudonym she had adopted decades ago to protect herself and her family from the long, vengeful reach of the Manson faithful. She had spent her life in hiding, moving from town to town, working as a waitress, a cook, a woman of no particular public record. She had given interviews only sparingly, and even then her face was often obscured. Her voice a whisper of the terrified girl who had watched Stephen Parent die, and had heard the screams from inside the house on Silo Drive. Linda Kasabian's role in the Manson saga had always been one of profound moral complexity. She had been a participant, a driver, a witness who had not raised the alarm until it was too late and the blood was already dry on the carpet. But she had also been the one who broke the silence, who told the story to the jury in a voice so soft that the courtroom strained to hear, and who, in doing so, had ensured that Charles Manson and his followers could not escape the consequences of their crimes. She was granted immunity for her testimony, a deal that outraged many who believed that she should have faced charges as an accomplice. But Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor, had always maintained that without Kasabian, there would have been no case. She was the window into the family's inner workings, the only participant who could recount the murders with the specific, horrifying detail that the jury needed to understand what had happened. In the years after the trial, Kasabian lived a life of profound isolation. She changed her name, raised her children in anonymity, and struggled with the psychological scars of what she had seen and done. She was haunted by nightmares, by the faces of the dead, by the knowledge that she had been so close to the abyss and had nearly been pulled in entirely. The Manson loyalists, those who still worshipped their imprisoned leader, had targeted her for decades, sending threats and condemnation, branding her a traitor and a snitch. She survived, but the survival came at a cost. Her death in that hospital in Tacoma was a quiet, unceremonious exit for a woman who had been, in many ways, the most important witness in one of the most important trials of the 20th century. The juxtaposition of Linda Kasabian's death and Leslie Van Houten's release was a strange, poetic bookend to the Manson saga. The woman who had brought the killers to justice died in obscurity, her true identity known only to a handful of people. Just as one of the women she had helped to convict walked into the light of freedom. The moral calculus was impossible to reconcile, and the families of the victims were left to grapple with a sense of cosmic injustice that no legal brief could ever address. For Patricia Krenwinkel, the woman who had stabbed Rosemary LaBianca with a frenzy that had shocked even the hardened detectives who worked the case, the news of Van Houten's release landed like a stone dropped into still water. Krenwinkel, now in her mid-70s, had been incarcerated even longer than Van Houten, having been arrested in Mobile, Alabama, in December 1969, just days after the Barker Ranch raid. She was the longest-serving female inmate in the California prison system, and she had, by all institutional accounts, been a model prisoner for over 5 decades. She had earned multiple degrees, worked extensively with blind inmates, facilitated support groups, and expressed in her parole hearings a remorse that her advocates argued was deeper and more self-aware than Van Houten's. She spoke of the girl she had been, a lost, insecure teenager so desperate for love and belonging that she had surrendered her entire identity to a monster. She described the act of murder with a chilling clarity, acknowledging that she had not been a passive follower but an active, willing participant, and that the knife in her hand had felt. In those moments of madness, like an extension of her own rage and emptiness. But the parole board, year after year, had denied her release. The reasons were always the same: the cruelty of the crime, the vulnerability of the victims. The overwhelming message that releasing a Manson murderer would send to a society that still remembered the terror. The families of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca appeared at every hearing, their voices trembling with grief that time had not dimmed. Leno's daughter, Corey LaBianca, spoke of the father who had been carved with the word war, whose body had been desecrated with a fork, whose life had been stolen in the most savage manner imaginable. The board listened, and the board, more often than not, denied. Krenwinkel's supporters argued that her continued incarceration was a political decision, that she had met every standard for rehabilitation, and that the denial was based on the notoriety of her name rather than the reality of her transformation. But the families and the board and the public at large could not escape the image of the crime scene photographs, the woman in the nightgown, the blood on the walls. Charles Tex Watson, the man who had led the death squads on both nights of slaughter, remained in his cell at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, a quiet, gray-haired minister who spent his days writing sermons and counseling fellow inmates. Watson's transformation had been the most public and, to his detractors, the most calculated. He had found God in the early years of his imprisonment, had become an ordained minister, and had built a prison ministry, abounding love, that reached thousands of supporters on the outside. He had married, fathered children through conjugal visits before the practice was ended, and had produced a body of Christian literature that framed his life as a testament to the redemptive power of faith. His website, slick and professional, featured his sermons and his writings, a digital pulpit from which he preached the gospel of second chances. The families of the victims viewed Watson's ministry as a monument to hypocrisy. They pointed to the fact that, for decades, Watson had refused to provide a full accounting of his crimes, and that his initial autobiography, Will You Die For Me?, had been criticized even by his own co-author as a work of self-serving omission. Watson eventually provided a more complete confession in a series of legal depositions, describing the murders with a clinical, almost detached precision. But the damage to his credibility had been done. The parole board, confronted with the evidence of his rehabilitation and the enduring horror of his acts, repeatedly denied his bids for release. Watson remains in prison, his fate sealed by the sheer, unbridgeable gulf between the gentle minister and the man who had shot Stephen Parent in the face without a moment's hesitation. The cultural machinery that had grown up around the Manson murders continued to churn in the years surrounding these events, a vast, insatiable industry of books, documentaries, podcasts, and feature films that fed the public's endless fascination with the darkness. The 50th anniversary of the murders in August 2019 had unleashed a torrent of media that rivaled the coverage of the original crimes. Every major network and streaming service produced its own take on the story. There were multi-part documentary series that promised new, never-before-seen evidence. Dramatic reenactments that used cutting-edge visual effects to reconstruct the blood-soaked rooms of CeeLo Drive. And podcasts hosted by earnest young journalists who retraced the winding canyon roads in search of a fresh angle. The most prominent and controversial of these commemorations was Quentin Tarantino's film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, a sprawling, sun-drenched fantasy that rewrote history with a flamethrower and a pit bull. In Tarantino's alternate universe, the Manson followers who drove up CeeLo Drive on that August night were met not by a pregnant actress and her friends, but by a washed-up stuntman and his loyal dog, who dispatched them with a righteous, cathartic violence that left audiences cheering. The film was a massive critical and commercial success, and it reignited the cultural conversation about the ethics of using real-life tragedy as the raw material for entertainment. Sharon Tate, played with luminous, gentle grace by Margot Robbie, was portrayed not as a victim, but as a symbol of all that was beautiful and hopeful about the late 1960s, a ghost given a brief, joyful reprieve from her fate. Deborah Tate, who had consulted on the film and given it her cautious blessing, spoke of the strange, bittersweet experience of seeing her sister alive again on the big screen. She said that the film had captured the essence of who Sharon was, her kindness, her light, and that the fantasy of her survival was a gift, however fleeting. But she also acknowledged the troubling reality that the Manson story, no matter how it was told, was a commodity, a product that could be packaged and sold, and that the families of the victims were often left to deal with the emotional fallout while others profited. The true crime genre, which had exploded in popularity in the 2010s with the rise of podcasting and streaming, found in the Manson case an endlessly renewable resource. Every new generation of armchair detectives discovered the story, and every new generation of content creators sought to make their mark on it. The ethics of this cottage industry were the subject of fierce debate. The families of the victims, who had never sought the spotlight, found themselves once again at the center of a media maelstrom, their grief harvested for clicks and ratings. Deborah Tate became a vocal critic of what she saw as the glamorization of the killers. The tendency to focus on the twisted charisma of Charles Manson, while forgetting the names and faces of the people he had murdered. She campaigned tirelessly to keep the focus on the victims, to ensure that the cultural narrative did not become a celebration of the monster at the expense of the innocent. The fascination with Manson himself showed no signs of abating, even years after his death. The legal battle over his remains, which had raged through the Kern County courts for 4 months, was a macabre spectacle that encapsulated the bizarre, almost religious devotion that he still inspired. 3 claimants: a purported grandson, a pen pal with a contested will, and a biological son who had spent his life running from the name, had fought for the right to dispose of the corpse. The grandson, Jason Freeman, eventually prevailed, and the body was cremated and scattered at a secret location. The ashes of Charles Manson, the man who had dreamed of global cataclysm and messianic glory, were dispersed into the wind, his physical remains as inconsequential as the child he had once been. The estate that Manson left behind was a pittance, but the value of his name and his image remained a contested asset. The rights to his music, his writings, and his likeness were the subject of ongoing litigation, a strange, ghostly commerce that persisted even though the man himself was gone. The fascination with Manson memorabilia, the paintings of Bobby Beausoleil, the letters of Susan Atkins, the crude artwork of Charles Manson himself, had created a black market for murderabilia that the families of the victims viewed as a moral obscenity. Laws had been passed in some states to prevent convicted killers from profiting from their notoriety, but the trade continued. Driven by collectors and curiosity seekers who were willing to pay thousands of dollars for a lock of hair or a signed prison photograph. The shadow of potential additional victims continued to stretch across the decades. The identification of a long-unknown Jane Doe in 2016 had briefly reignited speculation about the true scope of the family's violence. The young woman, found stabbed to death in the brush near Mulholland Drive in November 1969, had been known only as Jane Doe 59 for nearly 50 years. In 2016, a combination of DNA analysis and genealogical research finally gave her a name: Reet Jervetson, a 19-year-old from Montreal who had come to Los Angeles chasing a boy and had vanished into the city's dark underbelly. The location of her body, the method of her murder, and the timing of her death led some investigators to speculate that she might have been a Manson family victim. One of the runaways who had fallen into the orbit of the cult and had been silenced when she knew too much. The official investigation into the possible Manson connection was inconclusive. The detectives interviewed the surviving family members, who denied any knowledge of the girl. The forensic evidence was too degraded by time to provide a definitive link. But the mere possibility, the thought that there were other victims whose names were still unknown, haunted the families of the known dead and fueled the determination of the investigators who refused to close the files. The desert, as always, kept its silence. The psychological and sociological legacy of the Manson family murders has been the subject of decades of academic study, and the conclusions that have emerged are as unsettling as they are illuminating. The case has become a foundational text for understanding the dynamics of cults, the psychology of charismatic leadership, and the mechanisms of mass manipulation. The term Manson-like has entered the lexicon as a shorthand for the kind of evil that is not born of ideology or political grievance, but of pure, malignant narcissism. The experts who have studied the case, from the FBI profilers of the Behavioral Science Unit to the academic psychologists who have interviewed the surviving family members, have identified a pattern that has since been observed in cults and extremist groups around the world: the isolation of the recruit, the destruction of their identity, the implantation of an apocalyptic narrative, and the gradual normalization of violence as a sacred duty. The Manson case has also served as a cautionary tale for the criminal justice system, a stark reminder of the consequences of institutional failure. The miscommunication between the Los Angeles Police Department and the Sheriff's Department, which allowed the Tate and La Bianca investigations to proceed independently for weeks, has become a textbook example of the dangers of interagency rivalry. The reforms that followed, including the creation of unified task forces for major crimes and the standardization of evidence-sharing protocols, were direct responses to the lessons learned from the Manson investigation. The case also spurred significant changes in the way that victims, families are treated by the system. From the right to make impact statements at sentencing and parole hearings to the establishment of victim compensation funds. Doris Tate's crusade, born from the most profound personal tragedy, had reshaped the legal landscape in ways that would affect millions of people who had never heard her daughter's name. The children of the victims, now elderly themselves, have spent their entire lives in the shadow of the murders. Sharon Tate's unborn child, Paul Richard Polanski, would have been in his mid-50s now, perhaps with children of his own, a living legacy of the mother who never got to hold him. The LaBianca children, who discovered their father's body in the living room, have carried that image in their minds for more than half a century. A wound that no amount of therapy or time can fully heal. Jay Sebring's family, who lost a beloved son and a pioneering hairstylist, have watched as the cultural memory of the case often reduces him to a footnote in the Sharon Tate story. A man who died heroically trying to protect his friend, but whose own life and achievements deserve to be remembered on their own terms. Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress who had devoted herself to social work and activism, was a woman of intellect and compassion whose promise was extinguished before it could fully bloom. Wojciech Frykowski, the Polish screenwriter, was a dreamer and a survivor of wartime Europe, a man who had found a new life in Hollywood only to have it taken in the most brutal fashion. Stephen Parent, the 18-year-old boy who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, had a whole life ahead of him, a future that was erased by 4 bullets from Tex Watson's gun. And Gary Hinman, the gentle music teacher, and Shorty Shee, the affable ranch hand, are the forgotten names in a story that has always been dominated by the most famous of the victims. The surviving members of the family, those who never participated in the murders but who were drawn into the cult's orbit and managed to escape, have lived their own lives of quiet anonymity. Some, like Diane Lake, have found a measure of peace and have even been able to speak publicly about their experiences, offering a perspective that is at once deeply personal and historically invaluable. Others have maintained their silence, their identities protected, their past a secret they share with no one. The psychological damage inflicted by Manson's methods of control, the drug-fueled indoctrination, the sexual exploitation, the systematic destruction of the self has been a lifelong burden for these survivors. And their stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of an evil that sought to consume it entirely. The sun continues to set over the canyons of Los Angeles, painting the hills in shades of gold and violet, just as it did on those hot, endless evenings of 1969. The physical sites of the crimes have been transformed by time and development, but the memory of what happened there is indelible, a stain that no amount of concrete or landscaping can cover. The house on Silo Drive is gone, replaced by a mansion whose owners guard their privacy with the ferocity of those who live on haunted ground. The Waverly Drive house still stands, its current residents living with the knowledge that their beautiful home was once a charnel house. The walls that now display family photographs once smeared with the blood of the innocent. The Spawn Ranch is a ghost, its buildings reduced to ash, its memory kept alive only by the true crime pilgrims who hike the dusty trails and try to imagine the scene. The Barker Ranch, deep in the desert, endures as a crumbling monument to the final, desperate days of the family, a place where the wind whispers secrets that will never be fully told. The Manson family murders as a historical event are fading into the past. The last of the participants are dying, the documents are yellowing, and the cultural attention span is ever more fleeting. But the questions that the case raised about the nature of evil, the vulnerability of the young, the limits of redemption, and the responsibility of a society to protect its most lost and searching members are as urgent as they have ever been. The story of Charles Manson and his followers is not a closed chapter. It is a mirror that every generation must look into. A warning from a time when the dream of peace and love curdled into a nightmare of blood and madness. The monsters are not gone. They are only waiting in the shadows of the culture for the next lost, lonely soul who is looking for a family, a purpose, and a prophet. The desert still holds its secrets, the prison cells still hold the bodies of the killers, and the world still asks, with a mixture of horror and a strange, unquenchable fascination. The only question that can never be fully answered: how did it happen, and could it happen again? The autumn of 2024 arrived in Los Angeles with a quality of light that seemed to belong to a different era, a pale, golden luminescence that recalled the final days of a fading summer long ago. The city had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1969. The canyons, once the province of hippie communes and rustic hideaways, were now choked with the sprawling estates of tech billionaires and entertainment moguls. Their security systems bristling with cameras and sensors, their gates a formidable barrier against the curious and the obsessive. The freeways, which had once carried flower-painted Volkswagens and school buses full of runaways, now hummed with electric vehicles and the silent, algorithmic logic of autonomous navigation. The world that had given birth to Charles Manson, the world of the summer of love and the age of Aquarius, had receded into history, a sepia-toned photograph of a time that seemed, in retrospect, almost impossibly innocent. And yet the shadow of that long-ago August persisted. The name Charles Manson, spoken in a certain tone, could still evoke a shiver, a dark ripple in the collective consciousness. The last of the murderers were still alive, still imprisoned, still appearing before parole boards with their gray hair and their expressions of long-practiced remorse. The families of the dead were still alive, too, still carrying the weight of their loss with a dignity that time had only deepened. The story had been told so many times, in so many formats, that it had become a kind of modern myth. A cautionary tale that every generation discovered anew, and every generation failed to fully comprehend. Leslie Van Houten, the homecoming princess-turned-killer, had been out of prison for over a year now. Her release in July of 2023 had been a media sensation. But the woman who emerged from the California institution for women had very little in common with the girl who had plunged a knife into Rosemary LaBianca's body in the summer of 1969. She was a septuagenarian, her body frail, her eyes carrying the hollow, distant look of someone who had spent more than 5 decades in an institutional environment and was now confronting a world of smartphones and social media and a pace of life that seemed alien and overwhelming. She had been moved to a transitional housing facility, a modest, unremarkable building in a nondescript neighborhood where she was learning, slowly and with difficulty, how to navigate the mundane tasks of daily life, grocery shopping, using a computer, interacting with people who did not wear uniforms. She was, by all accounts, a quiet, unassuming presence, a ghost from a terrible past who had been granted a final, strange chapter in a life that had been defined by one night of absolute darkness. Her existence on the outside was not without its tensions. The public, or at least that portion of the public that still followed the Manson saga with morbid fascination, remained deeply divided. There were those who believed that her release was a travesty of justice, a betrayal of the dead, and they expressed their outrage in letters and online forums and the occasional protest outside her residence. And there were those who saw her as a symbol of the possibility of redemption, a living argument that even the most shattered soul could be remade through decades of genuine contrition and self-examination. Van Houten herself remained largely silent, declining interviews, offering no grand pronouncements. She was simply trying to live, to exist, to find some small measure of peace in the time that remained to her. The families of the victims, particularly the LaBiancas, had made their position clear. They would never forgive her, and they believed that her freedom was an obscenity. But the law had spoken, and the law, in its cold, imperfect calculus, had determined that she had paid her debt. For Patricia Krenwinkel, there would be no such release. The longest-serving female inmate in the California prison system continued to occupy a cell at the California Institution for Women, the same facility that had housed Van Houten for so many years. Krenwinkel was now well into her 70s, her hair completely white, her face deeply lined, her hands gnarled by arthritis. She had become a figure of almost institutional permanence, a name that appeared on parole hearing dockets with the regularity of the seasons and was always met with the same predictable result: denial. The board, year after year, acknowledged her decades of good behavior, her educational achievements, her work with blind inmates, her expressions of remorse. And then, year after year, they cited the cruelty of the crime, the premeditation, the overwhelming impact on the victims' families, and they concluded that she was not suitable for parole. The most recent hearing had taken place in the summer of 2024, and the scene had been, in its essentials, a repetition of every hearing that had come before. The sterile, fluorescent-lit room, the panel of commissioners with their impassive faces, the presence of the LaBianca children, now elderly themselves, their voices trembling with a grief that had not diminished in 55 years. Cori LaBianca, Leno's daughter, had spoken of the father who had been carved with the word war, of the mother who had been bound and stabbed, of the life that had been shattered in a single night of incomprehensible brutality. Krenwinkel had listened, her head bowed, and when it was her turn to speak, she had expressed, once again, her remorse, her understanding of the pain she had caused, her commitment to living a life of service and atonement. The board had deliberated, and the denial had been issued, and Patricia Krenwinkel had been led back to her cell to wait another 3 years for the next hearing, the next chance, the next ritual of memory and grief. Charles Tex Watson remained at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility, his hair now white, his body stooped, his voice, when he recorded his sermons for his prison ministry, still carrying the gentle, measured cadence of a country preacher. Watson's transformation from mass murderer to minister was, depending on one's perspective, either a testament to the redemptive power of faith or a grotesque performance designed to obscure the reality of his crimes. The families of the victims had no doubt which interpretation they believed. They had listened over the decades to his expressions of remorse, his talk of being a puppet of Manson, his claim that he had been a lost soul who had found salvation. And they had responded at every parole hearing with the photographs of the crime scenes, the autopsy reports, the faces of the dead. Stephen Parent shot 4 times in his car. Jay Sebring stabbed as he tried to protect Sharon Tate. Wojtek Frykowski stabbed over 50 times and bludgeoned with such force that the gun broke. Sharon Tate, pregnant, begging for her child's life. Leno LaBianca, the word war carved into his chest, a fork protruding from his stomach. The board, confronted with the evidence, had denied Watson's parole every single time, and there was no reason to believe that the pattern would ever change. Tex Watson would die in prison, his ministry and his marriage and his children on the outside, a strange, parallel reality that could never quite reconcile with the blood on his hands. Bobby Beausoleil, the musician who had tortured Gary Hinman for 3 days before stabbing him to death, remained incarcerated as well. Beausoleil had become something of a cult figure in the outsider art world, his psychedelic paintings selling for substantial sums to collectors who were either oblivious to or unconcerned with the history of the artist. His music, recorded in his cell with whatever instruments he could acquire, had been released on independent labels and had attracted a small, devoted following. At his parole hearings, Beausoleil spoke of his art as evidence of his transformation, pointing to the beauty he had created as proof that the monster who had killed Gary Hinman no longer existed. The family of Gary Hinman, who had been a gentle, struggling music teacher, a man who had opened his home to the lost and the strange, responded with a simple, unanswerable question. What beauty could possibly outweigh the horror of a man tortured for 3 days and then murdered for a phantom inheritance that never existed? The board agreed, and Beausoleil remained behind bars, his art accumulating in galleries while the man himself grew old in a cell. Bruce Davis, the quiet, sandy-haired drifter who had participated in the murders of Gary Hinman and Shorty Shee, continued to serve his life sentence with a low profile that had allowed him, to some degree, to escape the intense public scrutiny that followed Manson, Watson, and the women. Davis had become a devout Christian, a chaplain's assistant, a man who spent his days in prayer and counseling. His parole hearings were subdued affairs, lacking the media frenzy of the more famous defendants, and yet the board consistently denied him, citing the brutality of the crimes and the lack of sufficient insight into the root causes of his violence. The family of Shorty Shee, the affable ranch hand who had been lured to his death, dismembered and scattered across the desert, attended every hearing, their presence a quiet, unwavering reminder of the body that had been buried for 8 years before the truth was finally unearthed. The one member of the family who had been convicted of murder and who had actually been granted parole and lived a full life of freedom was Steve Clem Grogan. Grogan had been a young, developmentally limited man when he fell in with the family, and his participation in the Shee murder had been, by the accounts of investigators, that of a follower. A man easily led. After his arrest, Grogan had cooperated extensively with the authorities, leading them to the precise location of Shorty Shee's scattered remains. An act of cooperation that had brought a measure of closure to the Shee family and had earned him the gratitude, however complicated, of the prosecution. He was granted parole in 1985, and he walked out of prison a free man. He lived quietly, working as a laborer, staying far from the spotlight, his past a secret that he shared only with those closest to him. He died in 2009 at the age of 58 from cancer, having spent 24 years on the outside. His life was a strange, dissonant note in the Manson saga, a single example of a family murderer who had been deemed rehabilitated and who had, by all accounts, lived out his days without further incident. The contrast with the others who remained locked away was a permanent reminder of the arbitrary, unpredictable nature of justice and redemption. The physical sites of the Manson family's crimes continued their slow, inexorable transformation, the landscape itself collaborating with time to erase the visible traces of the past. The Barker Ranch, deep in the desolate vastness of Death Valley, had been the subject of a quiet, bureaucratic decision by the National Park Service. For years, the crumbling stone walls and the rusted debris of the family's final hideout had attracted a steady stream of true crime tourists, Manson obsessives, and vandals who had scrawled graffiti on every available surface. The Park Service, concerned about the safety hazards of the dilapidated structures and the environmental impact of the unauthorized visitors, had debated for years whether to demolish the buildings or let them collapse naturally. In the end, they chose a middle path. In the spring of 2024, a crew was dispatched to the remote location, and the remaining structures were carefully dismantled, the stones scattered, the debris removed. The site was returned as much as possible to its natural state, a flat, rocky expanse of creosote and sagebrush, indistinguishable from the thousands of square miles of desert that surrounded it. There was no marker, no plaque, no acknowledgement of what had happened there. The desert swallowed the memory, and the silence returned. The house at 3301 Waverly Drive, where Leno and Rosemary LaBianca had spent their final, terrified moments, had changed hands several times over the decades. The current owners, a young family who had purchased the property in 2022, had been fully aware of the history, and they had made a conscious decision to infuse the house with new life, new memories. The sounds of children laughing and the smell of dinners cooking. They had renovated extensively, updating the kitchen, repainting the walls, transforming the interior into a bright, modern, cheerful space that bore no resemblance to the photographs of the crime scene that still circulated in true crime documentaries. But the history was not so easily erased. The front door, the driveway, the shape of the living room window, these physical constants remained, and the family had learned to accept the occasional slow-moving car on the street. The flash of a camera, the pilgrimage of the curious. They had planted a garden in the backyard, a riot of flowers and greenery, and they had hung wind chimes on the porch. The sound of the chimes, soft and melodic in the evening breeze, was their quiet act of reclamation, a way of saying that life and light and love had returned to a place that had once known only darkness. The site of 10,050 Silo Drive, the house that had been demolished in 1994 and replaced with a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion, had become a permanent fixture on the dark tourism maps of Los Angeles. The current address, 10,066 Silo Drive, was protected by high hedges and a formidable security gate, and the owners, a wealthy couple who had made their fortune in the entertainment industry, guarded their privacy with the fierce determination of those who understand that their beautiful home is, for a certain segment of the public, forever haunted. The driveway where Stephen Parent had been gunned down was now lined with olive trees and lavender bushes, the fragrance of the herbs a deliberate attempt to mask the psychic residue of the past. The view of the city from the top of the driveway was as breathtaking as it had been on that August morning in 1969, the lights of Los Angeles glittering in the distance like a field of stars. The beauty of the place was undeniable, and the horror of what had happened there was, in a strange way, made all the more acute by that beauty. The two things could never be separated, and the owners had made their peace with that, living their lives in the knowledge that their home was a palimpsest, a text written over an older, darker text that could never be fully obscured. The Spawn Movie Ranch, or what remained of it, had been absorbed into the Santa Susana Pass State Historic Park. Its location known only to the most dedicated of Manson historians and the hikers who occasionally stumbled upon the few crumbling foundations that the 1970 wildfire had not consumed. The park rangers did not mention the ranch in their interpretive materials, and there was no sign marking the spot. The official position was that the site had no historical significance worth commemorating, and the unofficial position was that the less said about it, the better. The ghosts of the old western sets, the dust of the corral, the memory of the black bus and the young women with shaved heads, and the man with the guitar who had preached the apocalypse, all of it had been dissolved by time and fire and the relentless healing processes of the natural world. The cultural legacy of the Manson family murders, however, showed no signs of dissolving. The true crime industry, which had grown from a niche publishing market into a global multimedia behemoth, continued to produce a steady stream of Manson-related content. Every few years, a new documentary series would premiere on a streaming platform, promising fresh interviews, never-before-seen footage, and a revolutionary new theory about the crimes. The most ambitious of these projects was a planned multi-part series announced in late 2024 by a major streaming service, a series that purported to be the definitive final word on the case. Based on thousands of pages of newly released documents and interviews with aging survivors who had never before spoken publicly. The announcement was met with a familiar mixture of anticipation and exhaustion. The families of the victims once again were thrust into the spotlight, their grief once again packaged for public consumption. Deborah Tate, now in her 70s, issued a statement that was, by turns, weary and defiant. She would not participate, she would not cooperate, and she would continue to ask the only question that mattered. Why were the killers still the focus of the story, when the victims, the beautiful, irreplaceable souls who had been stolen from the world, were relegated to the background? Deborah Tate's advocacy, which had begun as a daughter's desperate attempt to keep her sister's memory alive, had by now become an institution in its own right. The Doris Tate Crime Victims Bureau, named for her mother, continued to advocate for victims' rights legislation, to support families navigating the criminal justice system, and to fight, parole hearing by parole hearing, against the release of the Manson killers who remained behind bars. The organization had grown and professionalized over the decades, its influence extending far beyond the Manson case to touch the lives of countless victims of violent crime. The legacy of Sharon Tate, a woman who had been reduced in the initial media coverage to a beautiful, tragic symbol, had been reclaimed by her family as something far more substantial. A force for justice, a wellspring of compassion, a reminder that the dead could still speak, and could still change the world through the voices of those who loved them. The other families, too, continued their quiet, dignified work. The LaBianca children, who had grown old in the shadow of the worst day of their lives, had become advocates in their own right, appearing at parole hearings, speaking to journalists, ensuring that their parents were remembered not as crime scene photographs, but as the living, breathing, complicated human beings they had been. The Sebring family, who had lost a beloved son and a pioneering figure in the world of men's hairstyling, had worked to preserve Jay's legacy, his innovations, his contributions to an industry that had been transformed by his vision. The Folger family, heirs to the coffee fortune, had channeled their loss into philanthropy, supporting the social causes that Abigail had cared about. The family of Stephen Parent, the forgotten victim, the boy who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had maintained a quiet, dignified silence, their grief a private matter that they had never sought to publicize. The family of Gary Hinman, the gentle music teacher, had kept his memory alive through music scholarships and charitable work. And the family of Shorty Shee, the affable ranch hand, had found a measure of peace in the knowledge that his remains had finally been recovered, that his killer had led them to his bones, and that he had been given at last a proper burial. The question that had haunted the Manson case from the beginning, the question of how many additional victims might still lie buried in the desert, remained unanswered. The files at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, the ones labeled with the names of long-vanished runaways and unsolved homicides from the late 1960s, were still technically open. But the detectives who had once pursued those leads with obsessive determination had long since retired. The tips still came in, but they were fewer now, and most of them were the products of delusion or the desire for attention. The forensic technology that had revolutionized cold case investigations in the 21st century had been applied to the physical evidence of the Manson murders. But the desert had yielded no new secrets. The bones that the cadaver dogs had signaled in 2008 had turned out to be animal remains. The additional excavations that had been proposed over the years had been deemed too costly, too speculative, too unlikely to yield results. The desert kept its silence, and the families of the missing were left to live with a grief that had no physical anchor, no grave to visit, no body to bury. The Manson family, as a social and historical phenomenon, was now the subject of a vast and growing body of academic literature. Historians of the 1960s, criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists had all produced weighty tomes that sought to explain, in the sterile language of scholarship, the inexplicable. The case was taught in university courses on the counterculture, on the history of crime, on the psychology of cults. The students who enrolled in these courses, born decades after the murders, approached the material with a mixture of horror and a strange, dispassionate curiosity. For them, the Manson story was not a lived trauma but a historical artifact, a cautionary tale from a distant era that felt, in its specifics, almost impossibly remote. They watched the grainy footage of the trial, the shaved heads, the chants, the X's carved into foreheads, and they struggled to understand how such a thing could have happened in that place. In that time, their professors, many of whom had been young adults in 1969, tried to explain the context. The war, the assassinations, the racial tensions, the generational chasm. The proliferation of psychedelic drugs, the utopian dreams that had curdled into apocalyptic dread. But the explanation, however detailed, always felt incomplete. The mystery at the core of the Manson case, the mystery of how a broken, unremarkable man could command such absolute, murderous devotion, could never be fully solved. The legal and political ramifications of the case continued to reverberate through the California prison system. The parole process, which the Manson hearings had transformed into a high-stakes public ritual, had been reformed multiple times over the decades, with the pendulum swinging between the rights of inmates and the rights of victims. The Victims' Bill of Rights, which Doris Tate had championed, was now a permanent feature of the legal landscape, and the voices of victims' families were an integral part of every parole hearing. The debate over the limits of rehabilitation, over the possibility of forgiveness for the unforgivable, played out in hearing rooms across the state. But nowhere with the intensity and the symbolic weight of the Manson hearings. The question of whether Patricia Krenwinkel, or Tex Watson, or Bobby Beausoleil, or Bruce Davis would ever be released was, in a sense, a question about the very nature of justice. Is the purpose of imprisonment to punish, or to reform, or to protect society, or some combination of all three? And what does a society owe to the families of the dead, whose grief is eternal, when the killers have spent decades in atonement and appear to have changed? The Manson case had no easy answers to these questions, and it was precisely that lack of easy answers that made the case so enduringly fascinating and so deeply troubling. As the year 2025 began, the remaining principals in the Manson saga were, one by one, approaching the end of their lives. Patricia Krenwinkel was 77 years old. Tex Watson was 79. Bobby Beausoleil was 77. Bruce Davis was 82. The actuarial tables made it clear. The next parole hearing, the next appeal, the next legal maneuver might very well be the last. The families of the victims knew this, and they prepared themselves for the possibility that one or more of the killers might die before the next hearing could take place. The thought was, in its own way, a kind of relief. The ritual of the parole hearings, the endless relitigation of the past, the fresh wave of grief that accompanied each anniversary, each documentary, each news cycle, all of it would, someday soon, come to an end. The killers would die, the families would continue to age, and the Manson case would pass from the realm of living memory into the realm of history. The wind died down, the desert slept. And the dead were at peace.